Now the journey moves beyond the earthly paradise and enters Paradiso. As the third canticle unfolds, it becomes clear that Dante organizes the universe according to a Ptolemaic model of the cosmos. Like Ptolemy, he conceives the earth as standing at the center, motionless and fixed, while 7 planetary spheres revolve around it. These are the Moon, Mercury, the Sun, also regarded as a planet, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond these lies the heaven of the fixed stars, followed by the 9th sphere, the prime mover, and beyond that the Empyrean, the heaven of fire. All motion originates from the prime mover. From it, time itself begins. At that farthest boundary are the roots of time, extending outward into the finite world. Human beings exist, as it were, beneath the shadows of time's leaves, which continually fall and are endlessly renewed. Such is the structure of Dante's Ptolemaic universe. Another crucial element of Paradiso is Dante's practice of associating each planetary sphere with one of the liberal arts, a tendency already seen in earlier works. The moon corresponds to grammar, and therefore its realm contains the language of grammarians and an expansive understanding of what grammar entails. Grammar here embraces poetry, history, and even certain rhetorical figures. The sphere of Mercury is linked with dialectic, meaning logic, and its contour is shaped by logical modes of reasoning. Venus is paired with rhetoric, an unsurprising union given the ancient kinship between eros and persuasive speech. Each seems to imply the other. Mars, the god of war, is joined with music, reflecting the belief that music is harmony composed of discordant elements. Consequently, this heaven conveys both attraction and conflict at once. Geometry is connected with Jupiter, whose nature suggests balance and temperance. Saturn is associated with astronomy. The heaven of the fixed stars, at least in Convivio, is aligned with physics and metaphysics, while the prime mover corresponds to ethics. Finally, the Empyrean is presented as the realm of metaphysics and theology. This arrangement signals a shift from Dante's earlier position in Convivio, where ethics had been declared the highest and most important discipline, the art to which all others were subordinated. In Paradiso, Dante recognizes that ethics cannot be fully separated from a metaphysical understanding of being. Throughout the canticle, he repeatedly rethinks and reshapes the relationship between these two domains. It should also be emphasized that much of Paradiso unfolds as an act of teaching. This intention is already implied by the distribution of the arts and sciences across the heavens. Dante's movement from sphere to sphere becomes an educational pilgrimage, passing through grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and the rest, until reaching metaphysics and theology. This pedagogical design is embodied above all in the instruction provided by Beatrice. Significantly, Dante's teacher in Paradiso is not an abstract figure such as Lady Philosophy, nor an allegorical personification of nature. Although medieval literature often portrays nature as a wounded or disordered woman who reveals cosmic secrets, the education here is far more personal. Dante learns from his beloved, who takes the place of other possible instructors such as Aquinas, Boethius, and Bonaventure, even though he encounters these figures along the way. Yet it would be mistaken to conclude that the ultimate purpose of Paradiso is to become like Beatrice. Beatrice herself will eventually vanish from the narrative. She remains visible only up to a certain point. Her guiding role concludes at the end of Canto 30. After that, a historical figure, the mystic Bernard of Clairvaux, assumes responsibility for directing Dante's final stage of education. Some readers may argue that, despite the lack of abstract allegory, Paradiso is intended as the record of a mystical experience, in which Dante moves beyond himself, beyond any rational grasp of the world. According to this view, he abandons his own subjectivity in favor of an all-encompassing vision of being. Yet this is not what truly occurs. Dante preserves both his rationality and his awareness of distance from any absolute cosmological totality. He sometimes adopts the language of the mystics, but this should not be mistaken for a literal transcription of mystical ecstasy, as though the poem merely approximated what a mystic saw and then dissolved into the ineffable. Although Dante occasionally invokes the language of inexpressibility, it remains a poetic construction, an imaginative leap into the absolute unknown, into a realm no imagination had fully explored. Those who might have reached such a place never returned to describe it. Dante plays with this tension. His language struggles against the threatening edge of silence. From a Christian perspective, being defeated by silence could be understood as victory, yet Dante remains suspended between these two possibilities. At its core, this third and final canticle is a poem about beauty, about an attempt to understand what beauty truly is. Plotinus defines beauty as the visibility of being, suggesting that life becomes perceptible only because human beings possess images and perceptions. Dante seeks to perceive this visibility, while also probing what lies beyond what can be seen. He knows that beauty is not merely superficial, even though one danger of dwelling on beauty is to reduce it to surface appearance alone. Thus, he situates himself between appearances and the conviction that hidden essences exist beneath them. With this perspective on Paradiso in mind, the poem opens in Canto 1. The glory of the All-Mover penetrates through the universe, and in one part shines more, and in another less. The rhythm and syntax immediately signal a transformation. In the openings of the earlier canticles, the poet places himself at the center as agent. In Inferno, he finds himself lost midway through life. In Purgatorio, he announces that his genius sets sail toward better waters. In Paradiso, this pattern is reversed. The first tercet deliberately brackets the self and de-emphasizes subjectivity. The focus falls instead on God, who becomes the true agent. God is the mover of all, and all things together form the universe. God appears here through circumlocution, not primarily as visible effect, but as originating cause. At the same time, the effects are present in the form of glory, understood as divine light. Dante reshapes the history of the word glory. Traditionally, from classical antiquity through the Renaissance and into Romanticism, glory meant fame, the survival of one's name after death through noble deeds. For Dante, glory becomes light, joined to the verbs penetrates and reglows. God is therefore presented in a double cosmological role, as source of motion and as source of light. This unites an Aristotelian conception of God as prime mover with a Neoplatonic conception of God as the principle of illumination. In both models, God participates in creation, and the natural world is inseparable from the supernatural. Causality does not simply initiate the universe and then withdraw into an unreachable elsewhere. Another key feature of the opening tercet is hierarchy. Light shines, more and less. Difference matters profoundly for Dante, because knowledge itself depends upon perceiving differences. Hierarchy unifies diversity through degrees while preserving individual identities. God is diffused throughout this entire graded structure, yet Dante is not a mystic who dissolves into the absolute. Subjectivity is not erased. He now introduces himself. He has been in the heaven that receives the most light, that is, the Empyrean, as close to God as possible, and he has seen things that no one who descends from that height can either know or describe. As soon as he asserts this intimacy with the beatific vision, he also casts himself as a visionary, one who has seen. Paradiso becomes a poem about the refinement of sight. Dante's vision is internal, not in the sense of blindness like Homer's, but in the sense of perceiving wholes. Hearing is linear, grasping one sound at a time, whereas sight can apprehend totalities. The expansiveness of Dante's vision makes possible the vast scope of his poem. He then reflects on the condition of his poetic language in relation to this vision. As the intellect draws closer to what it desires, it sinks so deeply that memory can no longer retrace its path. The mind yearns for its objects, yet forgetfulness intervenes. Dante may gain intuition and insight, but he cannot fully recall what he has known. Even so, he insists that whatever portion of the Holy Kingdom he has been able to store within his mind will become the substance of his song. What he offers, therefore, is only a shadow of what he faintly remembers. This forgetting is inevitable, because one of the central paradoxes of the poem is the impossibility of holding within a finite memory a vision of the infinite. How could such a sight be rendered except through traces and reflections? How could memory, itself bound to time, contain what exists outside of time? From its very beginning, Paradiso presents itself as a poem of paradox. Immediately afterward, Dante turns to Apollo, the god of poets, and adopts a posture of receptivity, presenting himself as a vessel who must be filled. This is the traditional language of invocation, the ancient gesture of asking the divine to speak through the poet. Dante specifically asks Apollo, for this final labor, to make him a vessel worthy of receiving the beloved laurel. He recalls the myth in which Apollo pursues Daphne, whom he cannot truly possess, and who is transformed into a laurel tree. What the god gains is not the beloved herself, but a metaphorical substitute, the crown of leaves. Desire is thus displaced, never fully satisfied. This pattern becomes a figure for Dante's own journey in Paradiso, yet this attitude of humility is soon counterbalanced by imagery of struggle. Dante remarks that until now a single peak of Parnassus has been enough, but that he now needs both peaks as he enters the arena that remains. The arena is a place of combat, and Dante reinforces this sense of conflict when he asks Apollo to enter his breast and breathe there as he once drew Marsyas from the sheath of his limbs. The myth recalls the contest in which Marsyas dared to challenge Apollo and was defeated and flayed for his presumption. Dante does not wish to imitate Marsyas' arrogance. On the contrary, this passage expresses his fear that, in attempting to describe paradise, he may be overstepping human limits, intruding upon what belongs solely to God. The danger of blasphemy weighs heavily on him. He therefore begs the divine power to lend itself to him, so that he may show the image of the blessed realm imprinted in his mind. If granted this aid, he promises to come to the beloved laurel and be crowned with its leaves, but only if he is made worthy of them. Laurel crowns, he observes, are now rarely sought, whether by emperor or poet, a sign of the poverty and shame of human desire. Yet even a small spark can kindle a great flame. Dante struggles to find a fitting language for heaven while remaining vigilant against pride. Throughout this opening movement, Dante is in motion. He believes himself still on earth, but soon realizes that he has already entered the heaven of the moon. He describes a transformation that accompanies this ascent. Beatrice stands with her eyes fixed upon the eternal spheres, and he fixes his gaze upon her, withdrawing from everything else. By looking at her, he becomes inwardly like Glaucus, who, after tasting a wondrous herb, was transformed into a sea-dwelling god. The reference, drawn from Ovid, emphasizes an inner metamorphosis. The change happens within, not as an outward alteration, but as a deep shift in being. Dante then alludes to another encounter with the divine. He wonders whether he was only that part of himself which God created last, and acknowledges that only divine love, which rules the heavens, knows how he was lifted upward by its light. This recalls the account in the second letter to the Corinthians, where St. Paul speaks of being caught up to the third heaven. In medieval thought, the third heaven signified the highest mode of vision, beyond the literal and the imaginative, a state of ecstatic contemplation. Paul experienced the beatific vision and returned unable to speak of what he had seen, believing silence to be the only adequate response. Paradiso continually explores limits and the difficulty of defining them. Dante, unlike Paul, chooses not to remain silent. He will continue to speak until memory itself finally fails. His poetic position thus lies between two extremes. He does not wish to be as presumptuous as Marsyas, yet he also refuses to withdraw into total silence like Paul. He situates his voice in the tense space between daring and restraint. To grasp more fully how Dante understands his own poetic powers, it is helpful to step for a moment outside the poem itself. While living in Ravenna, Dante chose to send the first 10 cantos of Paradiso to Can Grande, the great dog of Verona, who had served as his patron for many years. He accompanied these cantos with a letter now known as the Letter to Can Grande. In this letter, Dante appeals to authorities such as Aristotle, Ezekiel, Richard of St. Victor, Bernard of Clairvaux, and Daniel in order to defend what might seem like daring or transgressive descriptions of visionary experience in Paradiso. Both the poem and the letter draw upon models from the contemplative philosophical tradition. Dante is not primarily a disciple of the prophetic tradition, yet he brings prophets and philosophers into agreement. He observes that readers of the Bible may insist there is no necessary connection between mystics, who experience visions, and prophets. For Dante, however, these are not separate states. Vision and speech belong together. One must see in order to speak, and this union defines the sense of poetry that governs the opening of Paradiso. On a more immediate level, Dante is still trying to understand what is happening to him. He believed he was standing on earth, in the earthly paradise, yet now he seems to be located on another planet. Beatrice corrects the mistaken images he has formed. She tells him that he dulls himself with false imagining, which prevents him from seeing what he would see if he abandoned it. He is not on earth, as he supposes. No lightning ever flew so swiftly from its proper place as he has returned to his own. Dante has travelled from the earthly paradise to the moon at the speed of light, so rapidly that the movement escaped perception. This explanation, however, does not end his questions. Although he is freed from one perplexity, he immediately finds himself entangled in another. He had already made peace with one great wonder, but now he marvels at how it is possible for him to pass through bodies made of light. Paradiso unfolds through this economy of questioning. The pilgrim experiences doubts, Beatrice resolves them, and those very answers generate new doubts. It is a continual expansion of the mind, which never ceases to be filled with wonder. This wonder is central to the aesthetic of Paradiso. The term translates the Latin admiratio, which in medieval thought designates what is now called the sublime. It names the experience of a mind overwhelmed by realities greater than itself, realities it cannot fully comprehend. Such sublimity can be found in nature, in art, or in other manifestations of greatness. Dante's Paradise therefore moves in an oscillation between an open, questioning, critical mind and the overpowering encounter with the sublime that floods that openness. The idea of the sublime also shapes the way Beatrice begins to present an image of the universe. With a deep breath and a glance that gently casts Dante as a misguided child, she offers him his first vision of cosmic order. This image will later be refined, but it corresponds to what he is capable of understanding at this stage. She explains that all things possess order among themselves, and that this order is the form that makes the universe resemble God. The image she evokes is one of beauty, and beauty implies vision, since it is defined as that which, when seen, gives pleasure, according to Aquinas. Here Beatrice moves beyond a purely subjective notion of beauty and gestures toward an objective structure of reality, as Aquinas does when he speaks of beauty as a transcendental property of being. Beauty often involves personal taste and individual response, yet there is also a universal order of the cosmos, marked by proportion, arrangement, and clarity. These qualities constitute a cosmological beauty so perfect that the universe appears to mirror God. Although this vision seems harmonious and reassuring, it also raises troubling implications. If the universe resembles God, how is one to account for the presence of evil within it? How are God's transcendence and God's immanence related? Beatrice will soon return to these questions and offer further clarification. This reflection on how the universe resembles God marks only the beginning of Beatrice's meditation on the natural order. She continues by explaining that the higher creatures behold the imprint of eternal worth, which is the goal for which this entire ordering of reality exists. Within this structure, she says, all natures are inclined by different allotments. Each being possesses its own specific gravity. All creatures are drawn by their desires. There is a natural instinct, a natural motion, by which a stone falls downward when released, and by which fire, once kindled, rises upward. This notion of specific gravity also functions as a spiritual gravity, shaping the movement of the soul. Not only creatures without intelligence are directed by this impulse, but also those endowed with intellect and love, namely human beings. Yet humans are not always guided by this natural inclination. Beatrice explains that just as a work of art may fail to correspond perfectly to the artist's intention because the material resists the form, so too a creature may depart from its proper course, even though it is impelled by nature. A being can swerve toward another path. Just as fire can sometimes be seen falling from a cloud, lightning descending instead of rising, so the primal impulse, when misdirected by false pleasure, can turn toward the earth. Within this account of cosmic order, Beatrice identifies human beings as the exceptional figures. They possess the power to deviate from the pattern. Humanity can undo what is given. There is a paradoxical freedom that allows people either to remain within the order intended for them or to break away from it. In this otherwise harmonious universe, human beings appear as the strange and unpredictable element. By affirming this freedom, Dante avoids a deterministic view of the cosmos, a view that would verge on heresy. Having sketched this larger framework, Dante turns in Canto 2 to examine his new environment more closely. He begins with a well-known medieval fable about the dark markings on the moon. According to legend, Cain, fleeing from the knowledge of his brother's murder, was removed from the earth by God and took refuge on the moon, and the stains visible there are his imprint. Dante rejects this tale and instead enters into a scientific discussion with Beatrice. Are the shadows caused by differences in the density of matter? Are they the result of light passing through lunar substance? Or do they arise from variations in the distribution of light? Beatrice's answer is that the shadows appear because the moon receives light from different sources. More broadly, this exchange demonstrates that the natural cosmos must be understood through metaphysics as well as physics. Physical explanations alone are insufficient. They must be grounded in a metaphysical vision. For Dante, the natural and the supernatural are inseparable. They are not two distinct realms, but two perspectives on the same reality. Dante's awareness of having entered a radically new region moves him to address the readers who have followed him thus far. He speaks to those traveling in their small boat, eager to listen, following behind his ship as it moves forward in song. He urges them to turn back and look again toward their shores. They should not venture into the open sea, for if they were to lose him, they would be left astray. The waters he is entering have never been navigated before. This address lends special poignancy to the image of the little bark. Even though Dante continues to speak in the language of humility, that modest vessel is engaged in an undertaking of immense magnitude. It carries him on a magnificent and extraordinary voyage. Dante urges his readers to turn back, yet he immediately narrows the group he is addressing. He calls out only to "you other few who lifted up your necks," reducing his audience to an elite company, a small circle of readers genuinely drawn to the deepest and most arcane sciences he is about to explore. He addresses them as those who have early raised their heads for the bread of angels, that is, for knowledge, on which human beings live and yet are never satisfied. These few, he says, may indeed entrust their vessel to the deep salt sea, keeping his furrow ahead in the water that soon grows smooth again. He adds that even the famed heroes who crossed the sea toward Colchis, when they saw Jason turned into a ploughman, were not as filled with wonder as these readers will be. Once again, the language of admiration and the sublime shapes the passage. The image of a sea voyage used to describe an aerial ascent signals a familiar metaphorical compression. Just as earlier a sailing became a mad flight, now a flight becomes a kind of sailing. Dante knows he is guiding others, and this awareness gives him a sense of responsibility. Unlike Ulysses, who led his companions into destruction, Dante warns his readers and invites caution, yet the deeper meaning of his warning lies elsewhere. The journey being undertaken is the act of reading this poem itself, and it becomes perilous because it moves across waters that leave no visible wake. This is the danger of seafaring. There are no fixed routes, no established roads, no reliable paths. Even if readers strive to follow closely behind him, they may still lose their way. Finally, Dante evokes Jason, the leader of the Argonauts who sought the Golden Fleece. This figure will reappear at the close of Paradiso, when Neptune, gazing up from the depths, marvels at the astonishing power of human imagination and will displayed in Jason's exploits. Neptune's astonishment mirrors what Dante himself will attempt, to behold God face to face and then return to earth. Yet elsewhere, in Inferno, Jason is punished among the seducers and flatterers for having deceived and abandoned Hypsipyle. Dante thus establishes a striking contrast between Jason's ethical guilt and the imaginative grandeur of his adventure. The distinction raises an important question. Are the good and the beautiful truly separate? Dante cautions against confusing them, and throughout Paradiso he will continue to explore the tension between the power of images and the ethical responsibility that accompanies them. In Paradiso Canto 3, Dante encounters two women, the Empress Constance, whose name carries an ironic weight among spirits known for inconstancy, and Piccarda. Piccarda had once entered a convent and taken the name Sister Constance, but she was later compelled to abandon the cloister because of the political ambitions of her brother, Corso Donati, who wished to arrange a strategic marriage for her. Canto 4 returns to this problem, which is fundamentally a problem of the will. What is the will? How can a person be forced by another's power to perform an action and still be held responsible for it? Alongside this issue, Dante raises another major question. He wonders about the souls he sees distributed among the stars and planetary spheres. Could it be that Plato was correct in believing that souls return after death to the stars, their place of origin? These two questions are closely connected, and their pairing is deliberate. Canto 4 opens with an unusual reflection on the nature and freedom of the will. Dante suggests, at first, that the will is almost inert. When faced with two equally compelling but opposing objects of desire, the will cannot move in either direction. It is the intellect that intervenes, providing the argument that pushes the will toward decision. Dante explains that a person placed between two equally distant and equally attractive foods would die of hunger before choosing either. Likewise, a lamb standing between two equally terrifying wolves would remain motionless, and a hound placed between two equally desirable deer would also stand still. Therefore, Dante says, if he remains silent while urged equally by two doubts, he neither blames nor praises himself, since such silence was necessary. Though he did not speak, his desire and questioning were visible in his expression more vividly than words could convey. This passage suggests a form of will, shared by humans and animals, a will that becomes paralyzed by symmetrical choices. When discussing free will, then, one may really be speaking about the freedom of the intellect rather than of the will alone. These metaphors express Dante's own perplexity. He has two powerful questions and does not know which to ask first. From a philosophical position influenced by radical interpretations of Aristotle, he proposes a hierarchy in which the intellect stands above the will. Beatrice identifies the core of Dante's difficulty. If Piccarda was forced to act against her own desire, why does she appear in the lowest level of beatitude, in the sphere of the moon? Why should she seem less worthy of a more intimate closeness to God? This concern, Beatrice explains, stands alongside Dante's other perplexity, that the souls appear to return to the stars in a manner that recalls Plato's teaching. Beatrice announces that she will first address the question that contains the most venom. Significantly, this danger does not lie in the issue of the will. The more perilous problem concerns representation. What is the mode of appearance of souls in heaven? Do they truly inhabit these planetary spheres? Or is this arrangement a kind of symbolic display, a theatrical manifestation designed for the pilgrim's understanding, after which the souls return to their proper dwelling? Why should this question of representation be more dangerous than the ethical problem of coercion? These concerns arise from the very poetics of Paradiso. How exactly does Dante represent heaven? Beatrice clarifies that even the highest beings, such as the greatest of the seraphim, Moses, Samuel, whichever John 1 chooses, and even Mary herself, do not possess fixed seats in different planetary heavens. All the blessed dwell in the highest circle and share eternal life, though they experience it in varying degrees, feeling more or less intensely the breath of eternity. The souls who appear in the lower spheres do so not because those spheres are truly their dwelling places, but to signify lower grades of celestial glory. In this sense, the entire visible structure of paradise is a kind of fiction shaped for the pilgrim's comprehension. Once the pilgrim's vision ends, these appearances will vanish, and the souls will return to their true home, traditionally described as the bosom of Abraham. Dante proceeds to explain why such allegorization is necessary. He states that it is essential to speak in this manner because the human faculty can grasp things only through sense perception, and only afterward can it make them suitable for the intellect. Paradiso thus becomes an accommodation, a condescension of realities that vastly exceed the mind's powers and must therefore adjust themselves to human capacity. The souls consent to appear in forms that can be understood. Earlier Dante had been reflecting on the limits of the will. Now he turns to the limits of the intellect. In Canto 4, these two concerns converge, each illuminating and reinforcing the other. He further clarifies that this mode of representation is not unique to Paradiso. It applies equally to Scripture and to the iconography found in churches. Language must adapt itself to human weakness. It must condescend to limited understanding and even attribute hands and feet to God, though these expressions carry meanings other than their literal sense. This is precisely what allegory is. The Bible employs such anthropomorphic images even though God possesses neither hands nor feet. These bodily terms signify divine power and majesty. By offering these examples, Dante shows that Scripture itself relies on a representational language, thereby legitimizing his own figurative portrayal of paradise. At this point, a distinction emerges between biblical allegory and Platonic metaphor. Dante notes that what Timaeus says about souls is not like what is presented here, because Plato seems to hold his statements as literal truth. What in Scripture functions as metaphor becomes, in Plato's discourse, an assertion about reality. Plato claims that the soul returns to its own star, believing that it was separated from that star when nature gave it bodily form. Yet Dante suggests that Plato's words may point to a deeper meaning that should not be dismissed. If Plato intends that honor and blame return to the planetary spheres, that the soul, when it falls, is touched by various planetary influences and later returns to the sphere from which it originated, then his thought may strike at a certain truth. Misunderstood, however, this principle once misled much of humanity into worshipping Jupiter, Mercury, and Mars as gods. With this explanation, Beatrice resolves the pilgrim's first question. She distinguishes between biblical theology and philosophical allegory, between metaphor as symbolic language in Scripture and metaphor as truth claim in Plato. At the same time, Dante implicitly authorizes his own practice. His entire poem is a metaphorical journey that draws simultaneously on biblical and philosophical traditions. He identifies a shared metaphorical ground between Scripture and Plato, and then employs it for his own poetic purposes. Why then is representation considered so dangerous? Because representation can eclipse what it refers to. It can turn appearances and simulacra into the only reality one perceives. People may end up believing that the image itself is all that exists. Dante himself risks falling into this error by assuming that souls truly live on the moon, and that the cosmos is literally a Platonic otherworld to which souls return. His journey becomes a movement between images and their possible meanings, a continual testing of whether behind appearances there lies substance, essence, or reality. He travels between these two dimensions and attempts to unite them. For this reason, representation stands at the center of Paradiso. Finally, this discussion of allegory clarifies why Dante designates the moon as the heaven of grammar. Each planetary sphere corresponds to one of the liberal arts, and the moon is linked with grammar in Dante's system. Allegorical discourse itself is fundamentally a grammatical matter. The other issue Dante raises in Canto 4, the one considered less poisonous, concerns the will. Beatrice explains why it is less dangerous. The other perplexity troubles him less because its malice could not lead him away from her. If divine justice appears unjust in mortal eyes, this itself becomes a matter of faith. The problem is easier for Dante because he distinguishes between a conditional will, what human beings choose when circumstances press them into action, and an absolute will, such as that of martyrs, those who remain steadfast and unshaken in the face of trial. Picarda and Constance were exercising their conditional will rather than their absolute will, and this explains their place in heaven. It is a subtle and important distinction, but, like Dante, it can be left without further elaboration. Attention then shifts to the heaven of Canto 6, the heaven of Mercury, associated with dialectics. Mercury is linked to dialectics or logic, even though the two are not identical, and Dante often uses the terms interchangeably. Mercury, or Hermes, is the guide of souls, the messenger who travels between worlds and carries spirits to the underworld. He is also the god of laws and the bearer of divine messages to humanity. Though he is likewise connected with commerce, that aspect has little relevance here. Ultimately, Mercury seems more closely aligned with logic than dialectics, yet Dante assigns him this role all the same. Dialectics is one of the arts of the classical trivium. It is the art that provides a method for distinguishing truth from falsehood. As such, it is a rational discipline, governed by reason and devoted to making careful distinctions. In this canto Dante is largely concerned with laws, which helps explain Mercury's presence. Here the pilgrim encounters the Emperor Justinian, traditionally regarded as the great organizer of Roman law in Byzantium. Justinian not only appears as a legal authority, but also recounts the history of Rome itself. The canto therefore becomes a meditation on history, and on whether Roman history possesses an underlying rationality. It asks what kind of justice informed its laws. The canto opens with the story of Constantine and the donation of Constantine. According to legend, Constantine granted imperial authority to the church in gratitude to Pope Sylvester, who had cured him of leprosy. This supposed transfer of power became the subject of intense debate. Dante rejects the donation outright and regards it as a catastrophic error, comparable in magnitude to Adam's sin. Like the fall, it confuses the sacred and the profane. By turning the Pope into a temporal ruler, it degrades moral authority and disrupts the proper order of the world. Dante alludes to Constantine again, but now with a different emphasis. Justinian explains that after Constantine turned the imperial eagle back from the path, it had followed behind the ancient hero who married Lavinia. The emblem of empire remained on the borders of Europe, near the mountains from which it had first emerged. There it ruled the world beneath its sacred wings, passing from hand to hand through successive changes, until it came into Justinian's own keeping. He declares that he was Caesar and is Justinian, and that, by the will of the primal love he feels, he removed from the laws whatever was superfluous and vain. This final claim amounts to a definition of dialectics itself, the art of separating what is unnecessary and empty from what is essential. The first allusion is to Constantine's decision to move the seat of empire from Rome to the east, to Byzantium. This act is understood as a violation of a historical metaphor, a governing paradigm known as the transfer of empire. In the Middle Ages, people often spoke of translation, the translation of learning and the translation of imperial power. History was imagined as following the path of the sun from east to west. When the empire reached the far western edge of the world, history itself would reach its sunset. By reversing this movement, Constantine interrupts that symbolic course and delays the apocalyptic conclusion, the end of time and the end of the day. For Dante, this reversal constitutes a grave disturbance in the economy of history. The other allusion in the passage points to Aeneas, from whom the westward movement of empire began after the fall of Troy. As the husband of Lavinia, Aeneas initiates the very process that Constantine later overturns. This is among the first moments in which Dante begins to employ geographical coordinates, offering a more explicit description of Europe. Such geographical awareness is largely absent from Inferno and Purgatorio. Dante is now asking what enduring meaning can arise from this historical Europe. At the same time, he distinguishes between Rome and Europe, suggesting that the history of Rome differs from the history of Europe itself. The emblem of Rome's uniqueness appears in Aeneas's 3 marriages. He marries Creusa, as told in the Aeneid. He marries Dido in what is essentially a marriage of convenience, and he marries Lavinia. These 3 women come from Asia, Africa, and Europe, so Aeneas's life symbolically embraces the 3 known continents and thus the idea of universality. Yet a specifically European context remains, since Justinian's discourse seems at first to celebrate the Roman Empire. This is Canto 6, and like Canto 6 of Inferno and Canto 6 of Purgatorio, its focus is political. But here the politics extend beyond the city, or even Italy, to encompass the entire empire. What begins as a celebration of Rome gradually becomes a critique of imperial ideology. Dante draws upon 2 opposing models. One is the Virgilian model, which praises the empire's origins through Aeneas and presents a hopeful vision of destiny, as found in the Aeneid. The other is the model of Augustine's City of God, which condemns the empire. By Augustine's time, the empire has already fallen, exposing the falseness of its claim to eternity. To Augustine, the empire is merely another episode in a long history of conquest, domination, and violence. As an empire, Rome is no better than those that have already vanished. These 2 perspectives sharply conflict, and Dante moves between them throughout the canto. The language Dante employs often echoes Augustine. At one point he notes that the imperial eagle remained in Alba for more than 300 years, and later recalls the duel of 3 against 3, a reference to the Curatii and the Horatii. He also recounts what happened through 7 kings, from the outrage of the Sabine women to the tragedy of Lucretia, as Rome subdued neighboring peoples. These episodes, drawn from Augustine's City of God, exemplify the lust for power and domination. They are stories of sexual violence, Lucretia's rape and the abduction of the Sabine women by the followers of Romulus and Remus. Such references suggest that the empire was born from acts of lawlessness. Dante thus adopts Augustine's critical view of imperial corruption, even while much of the canto remains deeply Virgilian. Here Virgil and Augustine stand in stark opposition. Dante brings these contradictory historical visions together deliberately. He neither fully endorses nor entirely rejects the empire. Augustine, despite admiring Virgil, concludes that the empire is a morally abhorrent reality in his own age, already in decline and unworthy of loyalty. His theological question becomes simple. What does it matter who governs, as long as they do not compel one to sin? True reality is internal, located in the inner life. Empires, in this light, are nothing more than vast acts of theft. Dante's position between these 2 poles becomes clear in a shift of focus toward the end of the canto. He writes about judging those responsible for offences that have caused great turmoil. One side upholds the yellow lilies against the public standard, while the other claims authority for a party, making it difficult to see which offends more. He urges that the Ghibellines practice their craft under another banner, while cautioning the new Charles not to strike down the lilies, for he must fear talons that once brought down a greater lion. The text briefly echoes Inferno with its discussion of civil strife between Guelphs and Ghibellines. Dante uses this civil war as a lens to mediate between Augustine's and Virgil's perspectives on the empire. To Augustine, he concedes that the empire has often been a negative force, and that true reality lies in the internal peace of one's will. To Virgil, he acknowledges the empire's role in establishing order and law. Civil unrest, Dante implies, demonstrates the necessity of a transcendent institution to contain human violence. In this way, he both agrees and disagrees with each thinker. Virgil overlooks the inner life of Christians, while Augustine ignores the need for external structures to regulate human appetites. Dante establishes a middle ground between these extremes. The canto closes with a semi-autobiographical reflection, recounting an emperor's praise for a counsellor now disgraced. Romeo Villeneuve, a Provençal courtier, had served a prince faithfully and rendered far more than he received. Deceived by crooked words, he was compelled to seek recompense and departed impoverished and aged. Dante's portrayal of Romeo functions as an indirect self-portrait, echoing his own experience of seeking sustenance amid political injustice. Finally, the canto raises a fundamental question. What is the relationship between dialectics and history? In the Heaven of Logic, Dante explores history because history itself functions as an encomium whose justification is never complete. The empire may have a reason, but this reason cannot excuse all its deeds. Through this reflection, Dante critiques both history and dialectics. Logic, like historical narrative, can be wielded as an instrument of power capable of legitimizing any action. In this way, the canto interrogates the limits of reason, law, and moral authority. Skipping discussion of the heaven of Venus, the focus moves to the heaven of the sun, associated with arithmetic and numbers. Here Dante encounters two circles of saints, two garlands of wise men holding hands and dancing around the sun, a dance of wisdom. This heaven can also be understood as a reorganization of the encyclopedia, a metaphor for the journey of education. Knowledge is circular. The mind moves through various arts and sciences, only to return to what it knew from a new perspective. In this way, understanding is deepened, and the heaven of the sun enacts that process. Canto 10 begins with a Trinitarian vision, the Father and the Son united by the breath of love. God, described as a primal and ineffable power, creates everything that moves in mind or space with such order that those who contemplate it taste of his presence. The Trinity becomes a unity, a kind of arithmetical paradox of theological fecundity, God as love generating itself within the unity of his own being. Dante then addresses his readers, inviting them to gaze upward. The cosmic wheels, where one motion strikes another, display the art of the master, whose gaze never leaves his creation. He points to the branching oblique circle of the planets, explaining that this arrangement satisfies the world that calls upon them. The focus is on the cosmic intersection of the equator and the ecliptic, capturing both the diurnal and annual motion of the sun, and inviting reflection on the Trinity through this celestial architecture. The placement of the Trinity in the heaven of the sun draws on Pseudo-Dionysius, a mystic whose writings Dante references. Pseudo-Dionysius proposes a mystical hierarchy in which knowledge is inseparable from love. His theology is solar. The sun, without rational choice, gives light to whatever can receive it, just as the good, existing far above the sun, sends rays of its undivided goodness to beings capable of receiving them. These beings draw from this divine goodness their coherence, vigilance, and well-being. Their desire for the good shapes them, exemplifying and sharing that goodness with others below them. In this depiction, the Trinity functions as an inexhaustible fountain, rather than a cause-effect mechanism. Unlike Aristotelian or Thomistic notions of causality, which rely on motion or teleology, Dante portrays God as a source that continuously gives, and all creation participates in this gift. This solar theology, derived from Pseudo-Dionysius, blends rational structure with a mystical depth that transcends purely intellectual understanding. Dante then sees the two garlands of saints and meets Aquinas, who begins an encyclopedic listing of the sages surrounding him. He introduces himself as one of the lambs of the holy flock guided by Dominic along the path of good nourishment for those who do not stray. Beside him on the right is his brother and master, Albert of Cologne, and he identifies himself as Thomas of Aquino. He invites the reader to follow his account around the Blessed Circle. Next comes the radiant light of Gratian, who served both courts so well that it is pleasing in paradise. Another light represents Peter, who, like the poor widow, offered his treasure to Holy Church. The fifth light, the most beautiful among them, shines with such love that the world below longs to know its tidings, Within it is the lofty mind granted such deep wisdom that no second such vision has ever arisen. This fifth light is Solomon, presented through circumlocution. The number 5 carries symbolic weight as the natural number for earthly things, and Dante proposes a difficult idea: Solomon as naturally perfect, possessing the perfection of intellect. His intellectual virtue lay in knowing what to ask for in order to govern his people wisely. This notion is potentially dangerous because if intellectual perfection exists naturally, there might be no need for revelation, intermediaries, or redemption. Dante himself does not endorse this perfection, and Aquinas will later step back from it in Canto 13. Aquinas continues listing the lights. Next is the candle whose earthly body saw most deeply into angelic nature and ministry, Augustine, then Boethius, who came from martyrdom and exile to peace, followed by Isidore, Bede, and Richard of St. Victor, whose contemplation, or rather consideration, a key term for Dante, implying movement with the stars, exceeded human capacity. Finally, there is Sigier of Brabant, an Averroist condemned for heresy. Dante places in heaven those judged unworthy or heretical on earth, showing that the idea of knowledge evolves, and that the canon of wisdom expands to include previously rejected voices. Canto 10, from this perspective, also illuminates earlier treatments in Inferno, where Averroists and Epicureans, like Guido Cavalcanti, were associated with a view that love and knowledge never interact and that rationality is dimmed by passion. Dante now revises these ideas by providing Sigier's address on the street of straw in Paris. He situates philosophy as a journey, a method, an exodus toward ultimate truths about God. Lecturing, as Sigier did, implied interpreting texts while moving along a path of thought, and here philosophy becomes inseparable from the movement toward theological certainty. Dante, as poet, progresses on this same journey, guided by knowledge, contemplation, and the pursuit of truth, while Sigier demonstrated invidious truths along the way. Dante then examines what these invidious truths are. He uses the term etymologically, indicating truths that cannot be fully demonstrated or grasped. Philosophy, in this sense, becomes an art of speculation, guiding the mind toward truths it cannot fully reach. In Sigier of Brabant's case, these truths include the immortality of the soul, a topic about which Aristotle expressed doubt, and the origin of the universe. Sigier held that the universe is eternal, a position that sparked debate among medieval thinkers. On one side were Averroists like Sigier, and on the other were figures like Aquinas, who argued that philosophy can demonstrate the universe's eternity, yet faith teaches that creation had a beginning. Without a beginning, there would be no foundation for freedom, innovation, or the possibility that things could be different from how they were before. These were precisely the notions challenged by Sigier's invidious truths. Dante rescues Sigier of Brabant to make a broader point. What is accepted as knowledge is never fixed. Human understanding is always in motion, subject to critique and rethinking. This process of reconsideration recurs elsewhere in the poem. For example, Bonaventure revises his view of Joachim of Flora around the notion of the Trinity, balancing Canto 11 against Canto 10. The canto concludes with a vivid image. Dante likens the movement of the glorious wheel of saints to a mechanical clock, a recent invention in the late 13th century, calling the faithful at the hour when the bride of God rises to sing her matins to the bridegroom. The wheel moves harmoniously, ting, ting, in sounds so sweet that the well-disposed spirit swells with love. Here, knowledge and love converge. The canto of intellectual contemplation becomes, simultaneously, a love song of eternal joy. Canto 10 thus marks a poetic shift. Dante moves beyond natural sunlight, ordinary perception, into a higher, personal vision where questions of knowledge take precedence. Beyond the usual limits of the cosmos, he asks what kind of knowledge is necessary. He revises the relationship between heresy and knowledge, challenging the canonical certainties that Aquinas appears to hold, while correcting misconceptions about Solomon in relation to Sigier of Brabant's alleged heresy. In this way, Dante reshapes the mind's approach to truth, starting with a mystical redefinition of the Trinity as a unity of love. Philosophy, theology, love, and learning are woven together as Dante redefines himself, his understanding of the world, and the poem itself in Canto 10. Canto 10 naturally leads into Cantos 11 and 12. At the end of Canto 12, Dante introduces Bonaventure, a Franciscan. Theologically, the Franciscans are distinguished by their belief in the priority of will and love in the act of knowledge. By contrast, the Dominicans, or Neo-Aristotelians like Aquinas, uphold the priority of the intellect in apprehending the world. The Dominicans were founded to teach in universities, confronting heresies and blocking their influence, while the Franciscans were primarily witnesses in the world. Both orders, however, are shaped by a shared commitment to poverty, a theme that requires careful consideration. Bonaventure, at the end of Canto 12, chronicles the life of Dominic, offering a striking instance of Dante's openness. Historically, Franciscans and Dominicans were often at odds, especially regarding intellectual premises. Yet Dante allows a Franciscan to narrate the life of Dominic, just as a Dominican, Aquinas, recounts the life of Francis in Canto 11. The two cantos are arranged as a chiasmus, allowing an intersection of voices and revealing the interdependence of the two perspectives. The final lines of Canto 12 serve as a counterbalance to Aquinas' encyclopedic account in Canto 10, which concluded with Sigier of Brabant. Bonaventure declares, "He is the living soul of Bonaventure of Bagnoria, who always prioritized the left-hand care in the great offices." He mentions Illuminato and Augustine, among the first unshod poor brethren who made themselves friends of God with the cord. Dante then presents Hugh of St. Victor, a theorist of medieval encyclopedias who wrote the Didascalicon, a guide to the stages of education, showing how the mind progresses from the material world to interior illumination before reaching God's supreme light. Next come Peter the Spaniard, a theorist of medieval logic, Nathan the prophet, David's conscience urging moral reflection, Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed metropolitan, exemplar of eloquence, Anselm, a theologian on the reasons for the Incarnation, Donatus, a Roman grammarian, Rabanus, a historian, and finally Joachim, the Calabrian abbot endowed with prophetic spirit. Bonaventure notes that the glowing courtesy and well-judged discourse of Thomas moved him to celebrate Joachim, as it moved the company of saints. This gesture honors Aquinas' example, demonstrating a dialogue and openness between the two orders, separate yet interdependent. Joachim's presence also functions as a counterweight to Sigier of Brabant in Canto 10. Dante has already mentioned Joachim in connection with the apocalyptic prophecy of DXV in Purgatorio 33. The Joachistic interpretation emphasizes the end of time and the imminent closure of history, envisioning a utopia of the spirit in the Third Age, when institutions and barriers are removed. Yet this prophecy demands a closure that is ultimately unattainable. Bonaventure himself had previously called for Joachim's views to be anathematized. In Paradiso, however, Dante allows him to make amends, offering a palinode that revises and redeems the earlier condemnation. Bonaventure found the ideas of Joachim of Flora troubling because Joachim's tripartite conception of history seemed to dissolve the unity of the Trinitarian life. His framework, dividing history into the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Holy Spirit, appeared to treat each person of the Trinity as a separate entity. For Bonaventure, this was heretical, yet now in Paradiso, he acknowledges that Joachim was endowed with genuine spiritual prophecy. What once seemed heretical is reframed as a prophetic insight, an intellectual speculation revealing truths about the future without specifying them in detail. Retrospectively, Dante legitimizes Joachim's vision and, in turn, affirms his own position in Canto 33 of Purgatorio. Dante shares Joachim's sense of the apocalyptic trajectory of history, while rejecting any attempt to fix a date for its fulfillment. Thus, Joachim is now recognized as a visionary among saints and grammarians. Another figure to consider is Nathan the prophet. Dante's inclusion of Nathan is deliberate. He could have chosen numerous biblical figures whose works are canonical, yet he selects Nathan, whose name means "he who gives." This mirrors Dante's own name and sense of giving, particularly in the context of the Franciscan ethos dramatized in these cantos. Nathan becomes a kind of mask for Dante himself, symbolizing the poet's aspiration for a posthumous life in the heavenly apotheosis. The encyclopedic ordering of the arts and sciences in these cantos follows closely from Aquinas, yet Bonaventure is the one who articulates and celebrates it. As a theorist of the encyclopedia, following the tradition of Hugh of St. Victor, he frames knowledge as a ladder. This metaphor, drawn from Jacob's ladder in the Bible and echoed in Plato, depicts the mind ascending in education and learning, yet capable of descending as well. Crucially, Bonaventure emphasizes that the lowest rungs are the most important, for without them, no higher ascent is possible. Knowledge is conceived as a proliferation of lights, the light of the senses, the illumination of books, and the divine light of God. This process of enlightenment is inclusive. Even those who ascend only a few rungs possess a self-sufficient, meaningful knowledge. The lower elements are as crucial as the higher, distinguishing Bonaventure's approach. With this image, along with Joachim's inclusion, Dante erases strict boundaries between what is heretical and what is canonical. This openness reflects the lessons of Francis and Dominic, underscoring the values of generosity and outreach, which are central to the heaven of the sun. The sun itself symbolizes divine munificence, giving without expectation of return. Cantos 11 and 12 explore this ethos of openness and giving. For example, Canto 11 opens with a critique of legalistic and logical forms of knowledge that attempt to define the world through rigid formulas. Dante, speaking in his own voice, declares, "Mortals pursue laws, aphorisms, priesthood, dominion by force or craft, plunder, civil affairs, bodily pleasures, or idleness, while he is free, received gloriously into heaven with Beatrice." This contrast between worldly pursuits of power and Dante's own spiritual freedom establishes a central theme of Canto 11, the liberation of the soul from conventional constraints and the embrace of knowledge as an act of love and vision. Dante continues with a brief prayer and the introduction of Dominic and Francis. The providence that governs the world, in its perfect counsel, ordains two guides for the bride of God, who, through the blessed blood, is espoused to her Lord and destined for delight and fidelity. One of these guides, Francis, is all seraphic in ardor. The other, Dominic, shines with the wisdom of cherubic light on earth. Dante notes that by praising one, both are honored, for their labors share the same purpose. This formula emphasizes the interdependence of intellect and will, of love and knowledge, and the complementarity of these two seemingly competing voices. What follows is a hagiography, the life of a saint, in this case, Francis, as told by the Dominican Aquinas. He begins with an extraordinarily localized description of Francis's origins. Between the Topino and the stream descending from the hill chosen by the blessed Ubaldo, a fertile slope hangs from a lofty mountain, from which Perugia experiences cold and heat through the gate called Porta Sol, while Nocera and Gualdo endure a heavier yoke. This is more than a topographical detail. It situates Francis in a precise, concrete location near the path to Perugia, and yet it will expand into metaphor. From the local to the cosmic, Dante invests Francis with the attributes of the sun, placing him in the heaven of the sun. Francis becomes a solar figure, continuously giving himself as the sun gives its light, echoing the mystical Neoplatonic imagery of Pseudo-Dionysius. Dante immediately shifts from this local specificity to a global scope, extending Francis's influence to the Ganges and the Orient. As the sun orients the world, Francis guides human beings. Those who have lost their way are illuminated by him. Those who have never known the way are enabled to discover it. Francis provides a moral and spiritual light, strengthening the earth with his virtue, and Aquinas then begins the narrative of his life. Beyond his spiritual leadership, Dante also recognizes Francis as a poet, the first in the Italian vernacular. In the Canticle of Brother Sun and Sister Moon, Francis praises the Lord through all aspects of the natural world, encompassing the four elements. The poem is ambiguous in its emphasis. It is not always clear whether the elements themselves inspire the praise or simply serve as its medium. This ambiguity enriches the rhetoric of praise, a theme Dante had explored in the Vita Nuova, where he distinguishes praise from flattery. Praising Beatrice, for example, is an act of acknowledgement rather than possession. Knowledge does not confer ownership. Francis embodies the same principle, praising creation freely and generously, and this poetic vision informs much of Canto 11. Dante continues recounting the life of Francis, capturing him in what can be described as a liminal stage. The word liminal, derived from the Latin limen, means threshold or limit. These concepts may seem contradictory, yet a threshold can be both a limit and an opportunity to cross beyond it. Dante presents Francis in this in-between position, straddling the world as it is and a utopian vision of what the world ought to become, a new order he will go on to establish. At this stage, Francis confronts the values of his time, and Dante narrates it with a metaphorical complexity. In his youth, Francis rushes into conflict with his father for a bride, yet the bride is not a woman but poverty itself. He marries poverty in the presence of his father, giving the act a quasi-legal legitimacy, and from that moment his devotion grows ever more ardent. Poverty, like an unclaimed spouse, has remained undisturbed for ages, and now Francis unites with it, creating harmony and joy that inspire holy thoughts. This union, described in the language of medieval love poetry, transforms the ordinary into the sacred and the mundane into the extraordinary. This is a deliberate reversal of worldly values. By marrying nothing, Francis subverts the conventional understanding of marriage, wealth, and social hierarchy. The act parodies legal and sacramental language, and even the discourse of courtly love, turning worldly norms upside down. His divestment of clothing symbolizes a rejection of social status, while the language itself, phrases like "none willingly unlocks the door" and "their harmony and joyous semblance," plays with the tropes of erotic and amorous poetry. Sexuality, wealth, law, and love, all central to worldly values, are inverted in Francis's radical critique. Poverty, in this sense, becomes a prophetic act, a lived challenge to the idols of the world and a declaration of a new, unexpected vision for human life. The name Francis or Francesco, meaning free or frank, resonates deeply with this vision. In embracing poverty, Francis achieves absolute freedom, bound to nothing and entirely detached from worldly claims. Dante emphasizes poverty as a tangible, physical experience, not merely an allegorical one. In this prophetic mode, Francis bears the reality of poverty in his body, demonstrating an ethical and material commitment. Poverty extends to language and thought as well. Simple, repetitive, formulaic expressions, like those in the Canticle of Brother Sun, reflect the refusal to claim ownership of the world. The more one gives, the less one clings to possessions, the freer one becomes, and the more productive and spiritually alive one can be. In Francis, Dante presents a radical embodiment of freedom, generosity, and ethical integrity through lived poverty. Dante also links his own experience as a poor, exiled figure to this understanding of poverty. Poverty carries multiple layers of meaning for him. Bonaventure considers the poverty of language and the poverty of philosophy, yet all these figures understand poverty in a literal and human sense. It describes the condition of being born deficient and in need, a state that persists for some throughout life. At the same time, this shared lack is a blessing, as it allows for universal freedom. For Dante, the consolation is that he is not alone in his deprivation, especially since, unlike Petrarch, who died wealthy from his poetry, Dante never attained material success from his work. Poverty, however, is only one aspect of Francis's story. Francis seeks the official approval of the Pope for the order he founded, after his followers had increased, their exemplary lives deserving praise in heaven. The Eternal Spirit, through Pope Honorius, granted the order a second seal of approval. Dante recounts that, in his thirst for martyrdom, Francis preached to the Sultan, but finding the people unready for conversion, he returned to the fields of Italy. On the harsh rock between the Tiber and the Arno, he received the final seal from Christ, the stigmata, which he bore for 2 years. This is the famous story of Francis's stigmata, but it also includes his attempt to convert the Sultan. The encounter fails theologically, yet it represents a new hermeneutic in Dante's vision, an encounter between Christians and Muslims in a language of peaceful dialogue. Though the Sultan ultimately rejects Francis's arguments, Dante presents a scenario where conversation, rather than violence, mediates between faiths, marking a significant shift in the historical understanding of Christian-Muslim relations and interpretations of the Crusades. Geographic coordinates in this canto further expand Dante's vision of the world. Francis's journey to Egypt is mentioned, while his birthplace is earlier connected to the Ganges. Dante recognizes not only a Christian European world but also at least two other major realms, the Hindu world along the Ganges and the Muslim world in Egypt. This broad awareness prefigures Bonaventure's concern with reconciling multiple cultures. In one of his lectures in Paris, Bonaventure explores the relationship among three worlds: Hindu, Christian, and Muslim. He identifies a parallel between the Hindu idea of God's omnipresence and Joachim's Third Age, in which the spirit renders hierarchies and institutions unnecessary. Muslims, by contrast, conceive of a God with an insurmountable transcendence, invisible and distant from human concerns. Christianity, Bonaventure maintains, mediates between these extremes, combining transcendence and immanence. Dante echoes these concerns in the canto of Francis, positioning him between the Ganges and Egypt as a figure carving a new space, one defined by poverty, freedom, and love as the path to the knowledge of God. Dante clearly speaks from a Christian perspective, yet his underlying spirituality can be described as the spirituality of the desert. He is, in a sense, the poet of the desert, where journeys are quests toward the absolute. Every journey mirrors the path of others, and this shared quest tempers any perception of Dante as rigid or unyielding within the universe of ranks and distinctions that he constructs. Returning to the text, Bonaventure's account of Dominic in Canto 12 reconfigures the previous canto. Where Francis represented a parodic, anarchic marriage to the absence of worldly values, Dominic embodies a marriage between faith and knowledge, or between theology and understanding in the broadest sense. The hagiography of Dominic begins with his birthplace. In that region where sweet zephyr rises to open the new leaves with which Europe sees herself renewed, not far from the smiting of the waves, behind which the sun, after his long course, sometimes hides himself from all men, sits fortunate Caleroga. Dominic is placed in the western part of Spain, where the sun sets, counterbalancing Francis, born where the sun rises. Together, they mark the entire movement of the sun, symbolizing the translation of faith and culture rather than empires. The east-to-west movement of the sun, in this context, acquires its own rhythm and pace. Bonaventure continues, "Therein was born the ardent lover of the Christian faith, the holy athlete, benignant to his own and harsh to his foes. And his mind, as soon as it was created, was so full of living virtue that in his mother's womb he made her a prophetess. When the espousals were completed at the sacred font between him and the faith, where they dowered each other with mutual salvation, the lady who gave the assent for him saw in a dream the marvelous fruit destined to issue from him and his heirs." This marriage contrasts with the parodic union of Francis and poverty in Canto 11. The playful imagery, Dominic as athlete of faith, a liegeman of God, recalls that both Francis and Dominic were called clowns of the Lord, ioculators domini, because they challenge worldly values and introduce a perspective of play. Their theology is ultimately playful, reflecting the notion that God engages in creation as a kind of theodrama, serious yet imbued with joy. In Dominic's canto, language itself takes center stage. The Dominicans, as the intellectual arm of the Church, were associated with Aristotelian learning, philosophy, and teaching, and yet Dante emphasizes linguistic play. Oftentimes his nurse found him silent and awake upon the ground, as though he would say, "I am come for this. O father of him, Felice indeed! O mother of him, Giovanna indeed, if this, being interpreted, means as is said." Names and meanings intertwine. The father is happy, the mother is full of grace, highlighting orthodoxy as inseparable from language. Heresy, too, is framed as a linguistic phenomenon, an ambiguity inherent in speech. Even the schisms described in Inferno, including the poet holding his head as a lamp, involve questions of language, demonstrating its power and imponderable quality. Through Dominic, and previously through Francis, Dante presents a new aesthetic, a playful vision of the world, a comedy. The poem's designation as a comedy reflects this sense of joy and accessibility. Ordinary humans can experience the sublime, and the text achieves a happy ending, consistent with the comedic genre. Dante's use of vernacular Italian further emphasizes this accessibility. While tragedies, comedies, and elegies circulate within the Wheel of Fortune in medieval imagery, the underlying framework is this ludic theology, a joyful, playful vision of creation that Dante has been guiding the reader toward throughout the journey. As Paradiso reaches its midpoint, Cantos 15 through 17 take the reader into the heaven of Mars, named for the god of war, but also celebrated as the heaven of music. Dante connects Mars and music through the belief that harmony arises from the reconciliation of discordant elements, a concord achieved through the resolution of conflict. These discordant elements may be sounds, or they may be the passions within the human soul that require tempering. Canto 15 can be read alongside Canto 15 of Inferno, where Dante encounters his ancestor Cacciaguida, prompting inevitable reflections on Brunetto Latini. Both figures claim different relationships to Dante, whether as an intellectual or dynastic descendant, inviting parallels and contrasts. This canto also raises profound questions about self and history, a theme that has not previously been fully explored. In earlier cantos, such as Canto 6 of Paradiso, Dante recounts the history of Rome, its modest origins, and the decline of its empire. The notion of self has also been central from the beginning, in the Vita Nuova, where the lyrical self removes itself from the contingencies of time and the complexities of civic life, taking refuge in imagination, memory, and dream, constructing a true self. In the Divine Comedy, this autobiographical focus continues, but in Cantos 15 to 17, self and history converge in a new way, forming a dual lens through which the narrative unfolds. Dante introduces mythological references and figures to illuminate his reflections on selfhood, ancestry, and private history. Canto 15 opens with musical imagery appropriate to the heaven of music. Gracious will, wherein right-breathing love always resolves itself, as cupidity does into grudging will, imposed silence on that sweet lyre and quieted the holy strings which the right hand of heaven slackens and draws tight. Beyond music, Dante introduces the mythic reference of Anchises. Nor did the gem depart from its ribbon, but coursed along the radial strip, and seemed like fire behind alabaster. With like affection did the shade of Anchises stretch forward, when in Elysium he perceived his son. The mention of Anchises recalls the earlier reference to Aeneas in Inferno, establishing a link between the epic hero and the idea of belonging to history. Anchises represents the way one fits into a providential pattern. Aeneas journeys from Troy to found a destined empire, establishing the beginning of a new historical order. This is an epic conception of self in history, yet Dante complicates this conception. In the Vita Nuova, the self is a nexus of memory, fantasy, and poetic will. The text itself creates the subject, giving a poetic version of the author that doubles and perpetuates him. Dante thus challenges the reader to consider what counts as self, and what authority text or narrative carries in defining it. Similarly, history itself becomes a question. In Canto 16, Dante considers writing a chronicle of Florence, a city known for its medieval chroniclers. History might be understood as the record of events, or, as Anchises presents it, as a myth with paradigmatic value, capable of regulating and arranging human experience. Dante does not resolve this question directly, but he recounts the Florentine families in an elegiac tone, emphasizing their decay, extinction, and the impermanence of worldly power. Yet Cacciaguida rejoices that his descendant seeks to know the past, showing that the desire to understand history endures. In these cantos, the tension between self and history, and between personal memory and collective narrative, remains a central theme. Canto 17 marks a turning point in the exploration of history and self. It opens in a deliberately elaborate way, with the pilgrim describing himself through the figure of Phaeton, the classical character who dared to challenge Apollo. Phaeton, uncertain of his parentage, had to confirm that Apollo was indeed his father, and this illusion serves a purpose in the canto of Cacciaguida. Dante is reflecting on his own genealogical connection to noble ancestors, affirming a line of heritage with pride. History here is no longer simply a chronicle of events, but a genealogy. Such was I, and such I was perceived to be both by Beatrice and by the holy lamp which already, for my sake, had changed its place. Yet Phaeton remains a tragic figure, introducing the anxiety that a son may seek to surpass his father and disrupt generational continuity. This myth thus frames history as both inheritance and potential transgression. The canto continues by presenting another perspective on history. Dante observes, "Contingency, which does not extend beyond the volume of your material world, is all depicted in the eternal vision. The contingent, mutable world exists within a larger, necessary order, contained within the eternal vision." Dante questions whether contingency retains autonomy, or whether all events are determined within this overarching structure. Music becomes the metaphor that renders time perceptible. Therefrom, even as sweet harmony comes from an organ to the ear, comes to my sight the time that is in store for you. Time is translated acoustically, echoing the rhythms and harmonies of music, making the passage of time itself almost audible. Canto 17 introduces a third mythological figure, as Cacciaguida warns Dante of exile. As Hippolytus departed from Athens, by reason of his pitiless and perfidious stepmother, so from Florence must you depart. Unlike Aeneas, Dante is not destined to found an empire. Unlike Phaeton, he does not seek to outdo his father. Hippolytus, compelled to leave home by destructive family forces, becomes a closer analogue. Exile necessitates detachment from family, homeland, and all familiar ties. Cacciaguida emphasizes the duality of destiny. So is it willed, so already plotted, and so shall be accomplished soon by him who ponders upon it in the place where everyday Christ is bought and sold. Here, the distinction between what is eternally willed and what is contingently plotted is made clear. The practical consequences of exile are spelled out with precision. You shall leave everything beloved most dearly, and this is the arrow which the bow of exile shoots first. You shall come to know how salt is the taste of another's bread, and how hard the path to descend and mount by another man's stairs. Dante's phrasing emphasizes the naturalistic logic of descent before ascent. To climb in one sense entails a lowering of the self, a humbling that is both material and spiritual. Hippolytus's story, a stepson pursued by a destructive stepmother, forced to flee, ultimately to die away from home, parallels the potential hardships awaiting Dante. Exile, like the myth, is fraught with danger and the threat of loss. These three mythological images, Phaeton, Aeneas, and Hippolytus, collectively allow Dante to explore the self, its formation, its limits, and its vulnerability within the currents of history. This series of comparisons echoes the same profound concern with the self and its relationship to history found in the Confessions of Saint Augustine. Yet Dante diverges from Augustine. For Augustine, the self finds refuge in its own interiority, only rejoining history at the moment of conversion. Dante's approach is different. His self is one that participates in the history of the world through the act of writing a poem, this very poem. He grasps the essential quality of the human exilic experience, a perspective that Augustine does not fully embrace. There is no intention of disrespect here. It is simply a distinct experience of selfhood. The prophecy of exile, concluding Canto 17, introduces a new dimension to the self's engagement with history. Cacciaguida presents a model of self-sacrifice for a larger cause, the Christian crusade in Jerusalem, but this example, like the models of Aeneas and others, is ultimately rejected. Dante insists that the self inevitably belongs within history. There is no alternative. One can only exist by confronting the pressures and realities of the historical world. The political sphere becomes the avenue through which the exilic self navigates, a self defined by dislocation. Dislocation here is not a matter of total removal from the world, but a sense of being out of place and out of time, a polemical stance toward history. This is reinforced in Canto 15 through Dante's interplay with Cacciaguida, where puns and etymologies abound. The metaphor of wings, ali in Italian, as in allegory, recurs frequently. I speak to you, thanks to her who clothed you with plumes for the lofty flight. I turned to Beatrice, and she heard before I spoke, and smiled to me a sign that made the wings of my desire increase. And will and faculty in mortals, for the reason that is plain to you, are not equally feathered in their wings. Dante understands the etymology of his genealogy, while connecting selfhood to ascent and aspiration. The core of Dante's dialogue with Cacciaguida, however, focuses on the Florence of the past, evoking a golden age. He writes, Florence, within her ancient circle from which she still takes tierce and nones, abode in peace, sober and chaste. There was no necklace, no coronal, no embroidered gowns, no girdle that was more to be looked at than the person. Nor yet did the daughter at her birth cause fear to the father, for the time and the dowry did not outrun due measure on this side and that. Houses empty of family there were none, nor had Sardanapalus arrived yet to show what could be done in the chamber. Florence is imagined as a self-contained city, its circularity suggesting both sufficiency and boundaries. Time and space are orderly and interrelated, allowing the city to be measured and understood in its totality. Dante links the city metaphorically to a sober, chaste woman, evoking the notion of the body politic, where the city's parts function organically and interdependently. The repeated negatives, no necklace, no coronal, serve to strip away all superfluities, emphasizing simplicity and natural beauty, a return to the city's original virtue. This is Dante's vision of Florence's golden age, a period of harmony, chastity, and measured order. Dante does not necessarily take the myth of the golden age at face value. The praise of past times, or laudatio, functions as a rhetorical strategy to critique the imperfections of the present. In this way, Dante treats the utopian ideal polemically. Perfection is projected into the past because it no longer exists, yet the imagination of it persists. He preserves this vision because utopias, though unreal, provide a normative model that allows one to reshape contemporary contingencies and alter the course of history. While some thinkers warn that utopias foster illusions about identity, for Dante they become necessary tools to imagine alternatives to the degradations of the present. The myth of Florence's past, however, collapses when contrasted with Dante's own exilic experience, which lies ahead. Exile provides a realistic lens on one's place in history. Though it brings suffering, it is not punishment. It becomes a form of virtue and a paradigm with which others can identify. In Canto 16, this myth is extended with an emphasis on peace. The reference to peace evokes the city of Jerusalem, a model of a lost golden age, and aligns with prophetic traditions that recall times of peace as a way of sustaining memory. Canto 16 also foregrounds chronicles as a mode of historiography, distinct from the epic or universal histories of figures like Augustine. Boethius, in the Consolation of Philosophy, associates history with the cycles of fortune, where families rise and fall. Dante adopts this localized, family-based historiography to narrate Florence, recalling all the families to the delight of Cacciaguida, who experiences the pleasure of memory. Yet Dante soon recognizes that this past-focused history does not fully capture his identity or aspirations. His definition of the self increasingly depends on the future rather than the past. Dante then turns to a mythological history of Florence, recounting those who lived between Mars and the Baptist. Here, mythology structures self-understanding. Mars represents Florence's earlier divine patron before John the Baptist took precedence. Dante traces the shifting sovereignty of myths over the city with the precision of a chronicler. The narrative then shifts to mixture. The citizenry, combined with people from surrounding towns, produces disorder. Dante diagnoses this crisis as the intermingling of people, which parallels the body's vulnerability when overloaded, a metaphor for the city's moral and social health. He names this mixture confusion, linking it to Babylon. In Dante's vision, Florence embodies both Jerusalem and Babylon, depending on the moral life of its citizens. This ambiguity illustrates that the political world is continually reshaped. No single emblem or metaphor can define a city permanently. Its identity changes over time. Individuals participate in the city's history through their descriptions, aspirations, and creative interventions. Dante shifts the perspective from the chronicler to the poet, critiquing the limitations of traditional chronicles and asserting that history is not only a record of events, but also a medium through which one imagines and constructs the moral and political life of the city. In Canto 17, with the image of Phaeton, Dante questions his true relationship with Cacciaguida, who guides him and reveals what he can expect from the future. Here appears the famous depiction of Dante's exile. You shall leave everything beloved most dearly, and this is the arrow which the bow of exile shoots first. The severity of exile is captured in the sharpness of this statement. The severance from family appears at first as punishment. You shall come to know how salt is the taste of another's bread. While some have seen a hint of comic relief in the mention of Florentine bread being unsalted, the reference is serious. Bread carries sacramental weight, and Dante deepens the metaphor with an etymological connection. That which shall most weigh your shoulders down will be the evil and senseless company. The term company recalls the sharing of bread, reinforcing the unity and disunity of the body politic. This prophecy reflects Dante's actual experience. He went into exile in the year 1302 and spent years with fellow exiles plotting a return to Florence to defeat those who had banished them. Yet he realized that such a path would lead only to ruin, and thereafter he moves as a shabby derelict. At the opening of the Inferno, he presents himself limping, a fitting image for life in exile. It was not a matter of living in isolated comfort in a court. Exile meant wandering from place to place, often begging, and thus functioned as a form of punishment. Even among other exiles, Dante experiences isolation. Both Guelphs and Ghibellines distrust him and keep their distance. But soon after, their brows, not yours, shall redden for it. Of their brutish folly their own conduct shall afford the proof, so that it will be for your fair fame to have made you a party by yourself. To be entirely alone, a party by yourself, is striking. The Divine Comedy begins with neutral angels, those who choose neither for God nor against him, a state Dante regards as despicable. Yet here he attributes a similar condition to himself. This is not a form of neutrality, but a reflection of the destitution and loneliness that exile imposes. Despite this isolation, the exile retains a connection to the community. Dante transforms exile from apparent punishment into a form of virtue. The language describing his future emphasizes that history is best understood as futurity. Human existence is oriented toward the future, the only time in which one can actively define oneself. The past informs memory, yet when catastrophe strikes, only the future provides the possibility for self-definition and the realization of projects. In Canto 17, Dante's prophecy extends beyond exile to include the promise of refuge and support. Your first refuge and first inn shall be the courtesy of the great Lombard who bears the holy bird upon the ladder, and he will have for you such benign regard that, in doing and in asking between you two, that will be first which between others is the slowest. With him you shall see one who, at his birth, was so stamped by this strong star that notable shall be his deeds. Not yet have folk taken due note of him because of his young age, for these wheels have revolved around him only 9 years. But before the Gascon deceives the lofty Henry, some sparks of his virtue shall appear, in his caring naught for money or for toils. His magnificence shall hereafter be so known that his very foes will not be able to keep silent tongues about him. Look you to him, and to his benefits. By him shall many folk be changed, the rich and the beggarly altering their condition. And you shall bear hence written of him in your mind, but you shall not tell it. Dante is told things that surpass belief, even for those who will witness them. Cacciaguida adds, Son, these are the glosses on what was said to you. Behold the snares which are hidden behind but a few circlings. Yet I would not have you envious of your neighbors, since your life shall be prolonged far beyond the punishment of their perfidies. These glosses echo a moment from the Inferno, when Brunetto predicted that Dante's future exile would be illuminated by another, now revealed to be his forefather rather than Beatrice. The language surrounding this prophecy articulates an ethics of exile. Exile, Dante shows, requires and cultivates hospitality, gratitude and reciprocity. Courtesy and giving become essential virtues to endure displacement. Dante closes with a passage that utters the ethical and practical lessons of exile. I see well, my father, how time spurs toward me to give me such a blow as is heaviest to whosoever is most heedless. Wherefore it is good that I arm myself with foresight. Foresight, a human counterpart to divine providence, involves anticipating and forestalling the slings and arrows of fate. He continues, so that if the dearest place be taken from me, I lose not all the rest by reason of my songs. Dante recalls his experiences in the world, on the mountain lifted by Beatrice's gaze, and through the heavens, learning truths that might seem bitter to others. The guidance he receives affirms the need to reveal all he has seen, despite the harshness it may carry. A conscience dark, either with its own or with another's shame, will indeed feel your speech to be harsh. But none the less, all falsehood set aside, make manifest all that you have seen, and then let them scratch where the itch is. For if at first taste your voice be grievous, yet shall it leave thereafter vital nourishment when digested. This cry of yours shall do as does the wind, which smites most upon the loftiest summits, and this shall be no little cause of honour. Therefore only the souls known of fame have been shown to you within these wheels, upon the mountain, and in the woeful valley. For the mind of him who hears rests not nor confirms its faith by an example that has its roots unknown or hidden, nor for other proof that is not manifest. For Dante, writing becomes the palliative for exile, the means by which he survives separation from his city, his family, and his habitual life. Through the act of composing the poem, he enters and shapes history. This is not the heroic journey of Aeneas, the tragic ambition of Phaeton, the misfortune of Hippolytus, or even Cacciaguida's grand connection to history. Dante's self enters history through poetry. He transforms poetic language from a mere symbol into a tool of material and ethical reality. Words are things in themselves, carrying substance and truth value. Through poetry, Dante defines himself and secures his place in a history that is utopian, not bounded by any local city but measured by the project of justice and insight his writing embodies. Even in exile outside the city, the act of writing allows him to re-enter history. Dante envisions a unique path. The composition of poetry becomes the bridge between the self and the world, uniting them in a vision of justice and historical participation. In Canto 18, Dante begins still in the heaven of Mars, where he lists warriors, heroic souls like Cacciaguida. He mentions biblical figures such as Joshua and Judas Maccabeus, and then several medieval figures. Foremost among them is Charlemagne, whose campaigns in France and Spain against the Muslims justify, retrospectively, the crusades in which Cacciaguida took part. Dante also names Charlemagne's paladin, the legendary Roland, whose seeming invincibility was shattered at Roncesvalles due to his refusal to sound the horn that would have summoned his leader's aid. That moment became a traumatic image in the Western imagination, demonstrating that the myth of Christian Europe's invulnerability was fragile, vulnerable to conquering armies. Dante continues with figures from the Second Crusade, including Godfrey of Bouillon and Robert Guiscard. Through these names, Dante develops a thematic thread connecting previous cantos to this one, exploring what constitutes a heroic life. A heroic life, he suggests, can include defeat, as in Roland's case. There is a typology running from epic biblical narratives to contemporary history. For Dante, a heroic figure is not defined by unifying or transcending divisions, but by dedicating oneself to a cause larger than the self. Yet Dante is acutely aware of divisions, the necessity of distinguishing what belongs to one's own from what does not, what is ours from what is not ours. This insistence on separation, present throughout the comedy, acknowledges that divisions can both result from and provoke conflict. Over previous chapters, for example, Dante has drawn lines on maps between countries and continents, consistently emphasizing the logic of separation. Still, he regards Rome and Roman history as exceptional, transcending this logic. In the Monarchia, Dante understands that Aeneas is properly Roman, not Asian despite his origins, nor simply European despite his marriages to women from 3 continents. Dante distinguishes between histories that transcend boundaries and those that enforce them, such as the Crusades. Underlying the cantos from 15 through 17, and becoming more central in the Heaven of Jupiter in cantos 18 through 20, is an abstract question. What is a place? In Canto 15, Dante considered whether his history could be confined to his native town and concluded that it could not, since exile removed him from that soil. In Latin, exile simply meant being out of one's own soil, a physical state in the medieval understanding. Dante redefines exile as a spiritual condition, the precondition for his poetic work. In these later cantos, the question expands: what is one's own soil, one's own place, and how can it be defined? In Canto 18, Dante moves into the Heaven of Jupiter, a realm of white light that he associates with geometry. Geometry, a complex science, allows for the measurement of the earth and, through its etymology, implies perspective, the arrangement of space, and the measurement of depth. It also has an intimate connection with ethics, as seen in Inferno 28, where Dante establishes the principle of contrapasso, the proportional relationship between crime and punishment. Justice cannot simply mimic the harm done, it requires proportionality. Geometry embodies this ethical logic. Its extension begins at a point and always suggests the presence of other points. Geometry and ethics together provide a framework for establishing just and balanced relations. In these cantos, Dante repeatedly employs the language of geometry. In Canto 19, he introduces the concept of God as a geometer. The primal will, which of itself is good, has never moved from itself, which is the supreme good. All is just that accords with it. No created good draws it to itself, but it raying forth. The word ray in Italian evokes both a ray of sunlight and the radius of a circle, is the cause of it, as the stork circles over her nest. Early in the Heaven of Geometry in Canto 18, Dante presents a divine plane, a sacred theatre where God communicates to humans through the souls of the blessed. I saw in that torch of Jove the sparkling of the love that was there, trace out our speech to my eyes, and as birds, risen from the shore, as if rejoicing together at their pasture, make of themselves now a round flock, now some other shape, so within the light's holy creatures were singing as they flew, and in their figures made of themselves, now D, now I, now L. Within this heaven, even the letters of the alphabet are conceived as geometric forms, the semicircle of the D, the perpendicular lines of the L, and the vertical line of the I, showing that the beauty of geometry underpins the rigor of the alphabet. More importantly, these souls forming letters embody God's way of speaking to humans. The language God uses is human language. Humans themselves are the syllables and letters arranged to convey the divine message. Dante observes, they displayed themselves then in 5 times 7 vowels and consonants, and I took note of the parts as they appeared in utterance to me, diligite iusticum, cui judicatus terram. The letters spell out a verse from the Book of Wisdom. Love justice, you who judge the earth, linking geometry directly to the measurement of the world itself, as geography can be seen as applied geometry. A central concern in these cantos is justice. Dante seeks to understand divine justice and its relationship to geometry. In Canto 19 he says, well do I know that if the divine justice makes another realm in heaven its mirror, yours does not apprehend it through a veil. You know how eagerly I prepare myself to listen. You know what is that question which is so old a fast to me. An eagle responds, he that turned his compass round the limit of the world, and within it marked out so much both hidden and revealed, could not so imprint his power on all the universe that his word should not remain in infinite excess. The image of God the geometer echoes biblical passages, such as Job 38, where God asks, where were you when I drew the boundaries of the earth? And the Book of Wisdom, I was there with him, and I was his delight when he was drawing the circle around the deep. These texts emphasize that the forms of the world reflect the perfection of God's geometry. Dante then adds infinite excess, deliberately redundant, emphasizing the measureless nature of the divine. Even the word universe implies geometry, as the turning of the sphere completes a figure, the two hemispheres forming the whole. Through these images, Dante links the quest for justice with geometric order. Justice becomes most apparent in the mathematical reasoning of the passage. The eagle continues, "This is certified by that first proud one, Lucifer, who was the highest of all creatures and who, through not awaiting light, fell unripe, from which it is plain that every lesser nature is too scant a vessel for that good which has no limit and measures itself by itself. Thus your vision, which must needs be one of the rays of the mind with which all things are replete, cannot of its own nature be of such power that it should not perceive its origin to be far beyond all that is apparent to it. Therefore the sight that is granted to your world penetrates within the eternal justice as the eye into the sea, which, though from the shore it can see the bottom, in the open sea it sees it not, and none the less it is there, but the depth conceals it. The lesson is that human perception can only grasp justice superficially, like seeing the seabed near the shore, but not in the open ocean. God's justice remains as vast and unfathomable as the depths of the sea, beyond what can be fully measured or understood. At last, Dante receives his answer. Dante complicates the question of justice by asking where it can truly be found. Is justice confined to a single place, a continent, or the realm of Christian Europe, and how does it relate to other regions? While modern thinkers might call this notion alterity, the recognition of the other, the idea was not unfamiliar in the Middle Ages. People then understood otherness as an acknowledgement of the difference between oneself and the other. Up to this point, Dante has largely followed the examples of heroic lives, those who established boundaries and within them pursued virtue, but now he asks what those boundaries are. He recognizes that divine justice is impenetrable, yet he questions where it can even be located, what its limits are. In essence, he is again asking, what is a place? To explore this, Dante undertakes a kind of world tour in the remainder of Canto 19. He begins, "A man is born on the bank of the Indus, in Asia, and none is there to speak, or read, or write of Christ, and all his wishes and acts are good, so far as human reason sees, without sin in life or speech. He dies unbaptized and without faith. Where is this justice which condemns him? Where is his sin if he does not believe? From there he returns to Europe." The eagle, a symbol of Rome, appears in this context. After those glowing flames of the Holy Spirit became quiet, still in the sign which made the Romans reverent to the world. Here, Rome embodies an idea of universality. The eagle continues, "To this realm none ever rose who believed not in Christ, either before or after he was nailed to the tree. But behold, many cry Christ, Christ, who, at the judgment, shall be far less near to him than he who knows not Christ." Dante mentions Ethiopians in Africa and Persians in Asia, demonstrating divisions of belief across continents. Yet moral alterity also exists within Europe itself. Otherness is not merely geographic. A Persian is other, but moral difference can be found even among Europeans. Europe is far from uniform. To illustrate local diversity, Dante moves from Prague, which shall be made a desert, to France, where shall be seen the woe which he who shall die by a boarskin blow is bringing upon the Seine. He continues, "There shall be seen the pride that quickens thirst, which makes the Scot and the Englishman mad, so that neither can keep within his own bounds. The history of violence and transgression transcends boundaries. It will show the lechery and effeminate life of him of Spain, and him of Bohemia, who never knew valor nor desired it. It will show the cripple of Jerusalem, his goodness marked with an I, while an M will mark the opposite. It will show the avarice and cowardice of him who holds within the Isle of Fire, where Anchises ended his long life, and to indicate how paltry he is, the writing for him shall be in contractions that note much in little space. Plain to all shall be revealed the foul deeds of his uncle and his brother, which have dishonoured so eminent a lineage and 2 crowns. And he of Portugal and he of Norway shall be known there, and he of Rascia, who, to his harm, has seen the coin of Venice. O happy Hungary, if she no longer allows herself to be mistreated! And happy Navarre, if she arm herself with the mountains which bind her round! And all should believe that, for earnest of this, Nicosia and Famagosta now lament and complain because of their beast who departs not from the side of the others. This passage presents the moral and political history of Europe, echoing Dante's earlier account of the Roman Empire, but now as a history of desolation and ethical dereliction. Questions arise about what is here and what is there, what lies within or outside an economy of redemption. The truth is that no one knows. Salvation cannot be precisely mapped, and no human can decide the moral boundaries between one place and another. In this way, Dante separates political boundaries from moral ones, emphasizing cultural and ethical divisions rather than strictly geographic or religious lines. One way to understand Dante's approach in these cantos is to recall a story from Herodotus, the Greek historian. Herodotus tells it as a warning to the Greeks about the dangers of violating boundaries, arguing strongly for respecting limits. The tale concerns Candace, king of Egypt, who was not particularly wise. He had a remarkably beautiful wife and was so captivated by her that he wished everyone to know of her beauty. Rather than speaking directly to the public, he confided in his adviser, a prudent man, who responded, "Sire, I do not need to know. I believe you, but please say no more." The king insisted, "You must know. Not only must you hear of her beauty, I want you to see it yourself. Human beings trust their eyes more than their ears." The adviser protested, "Sire, this is too dangerous. I cannot disobey you, but I must insist this is unwise. I believe you completely. You may tell me all you wish, but I cannot see it." Ignoring him, the king arranged a plot. Each night, the queen bathed in a room adjacent to the bedroom. The king left a door ajar so that she could enter the bedroom afterward, and he allowed the counselor to hide in the shadows. When the queen came in and undressed, the counselor saw her naked, then slipped away silently, hoping not to be noticed. The next morning, the queen confronted him. "I saw you. Tell me what you were doing." The counselor admitted the king had commanded him to witness her beauty. She replied, "I suspected as much, but now 2 of you is one too many. It is unbearable that I have been seen naked by 2 men. You must either kill the king or kill yourself." The counselor complied and became the new king. The lesson is clear. The king lacked prudence. He did not respect the limits between private life and public duty, and by violating these boundaries, he lost crown, wife, and life. Herodotus warns of the necessity of setting and maintaining limits between what is mine and what is yours. Dante does not entirely agree with Herodotus, but he is similarly concerned with boundaries, particularly cultural differences, which he treats as morally and socially necessary. These differences allow for a circulation of ideas and for ethical distinctions. In these cantos, Dante seems to adopt a stance akin to Pelagianism, emphasizing the human capacity to live rationally and morally through reason and action, with the demands of grace and faith present but background. Dante seeks a dialogue between philosophy and theology, reason and faith. Philosophy without theology risks a labyrinth of abstractions. Theology without philosophy risks mere opinion. Exile, which makes one aware of the problematical qualities of place and self, allows Dante to integrate the philosopher and theologian within himself. In Cantos 21 and 22, Dante journeys to the heaven of Saturn, the heaven of contemplation. Saturn symbolizes time devouring all that it produces, a reminder that minutes and generations are consumed as they are created. This heaven is also connected to astronomy, emphasizing reflection and insight. There, Dante encounters contemplatives, including the soul of Benedict, founder of monasticism, representing a life devoted to meditation and the ordering of thought. In Canto 21, Dante begins with another mythological reference as he contemplates the nature of contemplation itself. "Already my eyes were fixed again on the face of my lady, and with them my mind, and from every other intent it was withdrawn. And she did not smile, but, 'Were I to smile,' she began, You would become such as was Semele when she was turned to ashes, for my beauty, which along the steps of the eternal palace is kindled the more, as you have seen, the higher the ascent, were it not tempered, is so resplendent that your mortal powers at its flash would be like the bough shattered by a thunderbolt. We have risen to the seventh splendor, which beneath the breast of the burning lion rays down now mingled with its power. Fix your mind after your eyes, and make of them mirrors to the figure which in this mirror shall be shown to you. This recalls the myth of Semele, the young woman who fell in love with a god. Ovid tells it as a carnal tale. Semele wishes to love Jupiter, and he consents on the condition that she never ask him to reveal his true divine form, accepting his disguises. But curiosity, impelled by love, drives her to insist, ignoring the god's warning. When he finally reveals himself, she cannot endure the intensity of his beauty and is reduced to ashes. Dante recalls this story to highlight the dangers of visionary desire. Beatrice warns him that his human limitations must be acknowledged. Mortal perception through images cannot yet be abandoned. The contemplatives he is about to encounter accept longing as a sign of God's presence and gift, understanding that true vision of God is not possible on earth. Dante may not be a mystic, but he is a contemplative in the fullest sense. Contemplation, derived from Greek thought, involves turning the mind toward essentials. The word comes from the Latin templum, temple, and tempus, time, both ultimately from the Greek temno, to cut. Saturn, representing time, cuts with a scythe. The contemplatives cut out a portion of time and space, separating it from history and profane place, making it a space for turning the mind toward higher truths. One such privileged space appears at the end of Canto 22, when Dante reaches the edge of the planetary system, preparing to enter the heaven of the fixed stars. Beatrice instructs him, "You are so near to the final blessedness that you must have your eyes clear and keen. Therefore, before you enter farther into it, look back downward and behold how great a world I have already set beneath your feet, in order that your heart may present itself, joyous to its utmost, to the triumphal throng which comes glad through this round ether." Dante obeys, casting his gaze down through the seven spheres. "With my sight I returned through all and each of the seven spheres, and saw this globe such that I smiled at its paltry semblance." From this vantage, space is not infinite but a vast, bounded expanse. This perspective allows Dante to provide an astronomical overview. "I saw the daughter of Latona glowing without that shade for which I once believed her rare and dense. The aspect of your son, Hyperion, I there endured, and saw how Maia and Dion move around and near him. Then appeared to me the tempering of Jove between his father and his son, and then was clear to me the varying they make in their position. And all the seven were displayed to me, how great they are and swift, and how distant each from other in location." Here, astronomy is presented mythically, through affiliation and genealogy. The daughter of Latona, the son of Hyperion, and the other celestial figures form a sequence as if the universe generates and reproduces itself, a cosmos shaped by order, relation, and movement. Dante then shifts from astronomy to astrology. "The little threshing floor which makes us so fierce was all revealed to me from hills to river mouths, as I circled with the eternal twins." Here he gives his horoscope indirectly, for the twins are the sign under which he was born. This is not an astrological lapse, it is simply a reference to his birth sign. By doing so, Dante blurs the line between astronomy and astrology, reflecting his era, when astrologers were not seen as mere superstitious practitioners, distinct from the rigorous science of astronomy. What is particularly striking in this passage is the pronoun us. Despite the vast distance implied by this cosmic journey, Dante does not separate himself entirely from humanity. On one hand, he asserts a perspective of eternity on the world, yet on the other, he refuses to surrender his place in time and history. He belongs to us, to humanity, and at the conclusion of this vast celestial circuit, he reclaims his role within human ranks. This synthesis of eternal perspective and temporal contingency is the ultimate aim of the poem and the pilgrim's journey, culminating in the vision of the Incarnation, where the immutable structure of history and the flow of time converge. Now Dante moves into the three cantos of the eighth sphere, the heaven of the fixed stars. Beyond the planets, this is the realm where he examines the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, or charity, distinct from the four cardinal virtues shared with classical tradition: fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. These virtues concern the understanding of the divine and open a horizon for reflection on the language of God, how God communicates with humanity, and how humans speak of God. This is the sphere in Paradise where Dante focuses on basic words, foundational terms through which humans come to understand themselves, words often used without full comprehension, yet here carefully defined. The three virtues are interdependent. Faith cannot be explained without reference to hope, hope cannot be understood without faith, and both are encompassed and completed within love. They are mysterious, yet they allow for degrees of understanding. Dante presents himself as a student undergoing a medieval-style examination. The three teachers are apostles. Saint Peter examines him on faith, appropriate since Peter's name signifies the cornerstone of Christian belief. James examines him on hope, though the connection is less direct. His recorded death in the Acts of the Apostles symbolizes hope and longing for eternal life. John, the beloved of Jesus, examines him on love or charity. Underlying these examinations is the persistent theme of exile. Dante frames these virtues as though they concern those of us in time, rather than the already blessed in heaven. In Paradise, the blessed naturally possess faith, hope, and love. They do not need instruction. But for humans in time, fallen and exiled, understanding these virtues requires reflection within the context of exile and the temporal condition. Time, fall, and human limitation form the backdrop against which these virtues are explored. Another important theme in this section of the comedy, particularly in Canto 26, is the question of language itself. Dante asks what the language of God might be. Is God something with a name? If so, how does Dante position himself in the debate over the Tetragrammaton, the four Hebrew letters thought to be God's name? Is God an unknowable reality that humans can never hope to name, or can knowledge of God be attained through analogical discourse? Dante explores different positions: the mystical stance, which denies any true knowledge of God's name, and the analogical stance, as articulated by Aquinas, in which human language can only approximate God, representing divine qualities through what we know in our own experience. In short, Dante confronts the challenging question: how can one come to know God? With this question in mind, Dante turns to the virtues themselves, beginning with faith. Faith, for him, is inseparable from a communal context. Canto 24 opens with an apostrophe: O fellowship elect to the great supper of the blessed Lamb, who feeds you so that your desire is ever satisfied, since by God's grace this man has foretaste of that which falls from your table, before death appoints his time, give heed to his measureless craving, and bedew him with some drops. You drink always from the fountain whence comes that on which his mind is set. Dante emphasizes the metaphor of a banquet, which functions on two levels: exilic, recalling the manna in the desert falling as dew on the Jewish wanderers, and eschatological, pointing to the heavenly feast. In both instances, food signifies the experience of community. This discussion is not about the formal profession of faith, but prefigures later debates of the Renaissance, such as those between Erasmus and Luther concerning Valor's text on free will. Erasmus argued that Valor defended human free will, a gift from God, through which humans come to recognize divine authority. Free will allows knowledge of God. Luther, in contrast, took a more radical stance, asserting that human freedom is illusory. For him, faith itself is the ultimate freedom, releasing humans from all constraints and mediating directly their relationship with God. Dante, however, avoids either extreme of radical subjectivity or absolute faith. He emphasizes the communal experience of faith, as represented by the banquet, while also affirming the individuality of private faith. Ultimately, it is about the self in relation to God. A notable moment occurs in Beatrice's words to Peter, as she instructs him to examine Dante. O eternal light of the great man with whom our Lord left the keys, Test this man on points light and grave, as pleases you, concerning the faith by which you did walk upon the sea. This alludes to the Gospel episode in which Peter walks on water at Christ's command. Peter is initially hesitant, teetering on the edge of fear and doubt, yet he ultimately proceeds. Dante uses this story to highlight that faith is not absolute certainty. It involves moments of crisis. Such crises do not negate faith, but demonstrate its dynamic nature, a dialectical movement between assurance and doubt, between receiving faith and questioning one's own possession of it. Beatrice's request is promptly answered. Dante frames the scene in the language of the university and academic life, as if he were undergoing a formal examination. The Bachelor of Arts, or baccalaureatus, arms himself with a weapon of knowledge, while the master, or magister, propounds the question, not to settle it, but to produce proof. Such issues always require open-ended argumentation rather than definitive resolution. Dante prepares himself. While she was speaking, I was arming myself with every reason to be ready for such a questioner and for such a profession. The examination begins. Speak, good Christian, and declare yourself. Here knowledge brings visibility. It brings one into existence. Peter asks, "What is faith?" Dante responds, "May the grace that grants me to confess to the chief centurion cause my conceptions to be well expressed. As the truthful pen of your dear brother wrote of it, who with you, Father, put Rome on the good path. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen." Dante invokes Paul to provide a canonical authority, stressing that faith is foundational, the undergirding of all things. Authority, for Dante, is earned, not inherent. One can question a teacher's opinions and still seek the truth. In the Middle Ages, Tertullian famously described faith as believing because it is absurd, placing belief beyond reason. Dante does not follow that path. Instead, he shows that faith and reason belong together. Knowledge and faith are distinct. Faith is necessary because reason alone cannot exhaust what is to be believed, but they interact. Faith is itself a form of knowledge, revealing truths that reason alone cannot apprehend, even as philosophy submits knowledge to rational rules. The examination continues. Rightly do you deem, if you understand well why he placed it among the substances and then among the evidences. Dante answers, "The deep things which grant me sight here are hidden from earthly eyes, so that their existence below relies on belief, upon which lofty hope is founded. Therefore they are designated as substance. From this belief we must reason without seeing further, and thus it receives the designation of evidence. The paradox of belief and evidence remains. Some things are visible here in the heaven of the fixed stars, but inaccessible to those living in the fallen world." Dante's response is a gloss on the medieval theological lexicon he has long employed. Peter accepts the answer but presses further. "Now the alloy and the weight of this coin have been examined. Tell me if you have it in your purse." Suddenly, faith is cast in the imagery of currency. Dante replies, "Yes, I have it so shining and so round that in its stamp nothing is doubtful to me." The deep light answers, "This precious jewel, on which every virtue is founded, whence did it come to you?" The metaphor of money conveys several ideas. First, faith is precious, as rare and valuable as a jewel. Second, the coin evokes purity. The Latin root menio suggests a warning, indicating the faith is authentic, not counterfeit. Third, like money, faith circulates, animating and establishing values within the world. Fourth, faith exists in the temporal, profane world, yet it retains the power to put things into motion. The metaphor's ambiguity demonstrates that while Dante is being tested on these virtues, he is also exploring their full depth and complexity for the reader. The next canto turns to the question of hope, examined by St. James. The Greeks never considered hope a virtue. It was one of the entities in Pandora's box, the last remaining element after all evils escaped. For them, hope was a delusion, a radical illusion, particularly for exiles who had lost their land and were left with nothing but hope. Dante does not follow this perspective. He finds a different horizon for hope in the Bible. Hope is a virtue of time, specifically of the future. One cannot hope for the past. Hope is inherently forward-looking. Moreover, hope is the most realistic of virtues. While the Greeks would argue that hope arises from desperation, Dante maintains that hope recognizes that nothing is ever truly finished. Its opposite, despair, appears in Inferno, Cantos 8 and 9, in the encounter with the Furies and Medusa, whose gaze turns one to stone, trapping the individual in the present or in a fixed idea of the past. Hope, however, shapes the future and, in a sense, reinterprets the past. Past disasters or disappointments may contain seeds for unforeseen future outcomes. Dante presents a vision of time in which hope and faith are inseparable. Hope cannot exist without faith. This existential understanding ties directly to his own hope of returning to his homeland. Canto 25 begins with an optative, a statement of desire. If ever it come to pass that the sacred poem, to which heaven and earth have so set their hand that it has made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty which bars me from the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, an enemy to the wolves which war on it, with changed voice now and with changed fleece a poet will I return, and at the font of my baptism will I take the crown, because there I entered into the faith, that makes souls known to God, and afterward Peter, for its sake, thus encircled my brow. Writing is an ascetic labor of the soul. It leaves Dante lean as if fasting, a ritual of dedication and discipline. The metaphor of the city as a sheepfold recalls the pastoral language of Virgil's eclogues. Dante situates himself in the heaven of hope, contemplating the final ceremony of Peter, whose blessing unites faith and hope. At the start of this canto, Dante casts Florence in pastoral imagery as a sheepfold, alluding to a messianic time when factions, the wolves or Guelphs, and the lambs will coexist peacefully. He also envisions being recognized as a poet at the font of his baptism, referring to the baptistry in Florence where he was baptized. This metaphor carries dual significance. The baptismal font marks the constitution of a community, and it reenacts the Exodus, recalling the crossing of the Red Sea. Here, hope intertwines with faith and communal identity, linking personal aspiration with historical and spiritual continuity. Dante asks how a poet comes home. Initially, the answer is one of hope. Hope for a homecoming where all are at peace, with a feast and celebration, a vision of the return of the victor. Yet he also frames this through the metaphor of the baptismal font, as if to suggest that the poet can return only to communicate to his community that he must depart again. Exile is the only message his poetry can convey to those from whom he has been banished. He gathers the community around the baptismal font to indicate that their place, at least spiritually, is in exile, a language of remaking and self-reflection. Beatrice presents Dante to St. James, emphasizing the theme of Exodus. She says that Dante is granted hope unmatched among the church militant, and that he may travel from Egypt to Jerusalem to witness, before his mission ends, how this virtue is pleasing. Dante's journey is framed as a movement from bondage to freedom, paralleling the Hebrew's exile, with exile serving as a central figure of the poem. Writing in the mode of exile, Dante shows that history itself must be understood from this perspective. Near the canto's conclusion, hope is described as a sure expectation of future glory, produced by divine grace and preceding merit. From many stars this light comes to me, but he first instilled it into my heart, who was the supreme singer of the supreme leader. Through this allusion to David, Dante unites past and future, history and hope. The final theological virtue is love, or charity. The progression is clear: faith, hope, and then love. One must understand the effects of these virtues before the beatific vision is possible. Love, however, resists definition. Unlike faith or hope, it cannot be captured in formulaic terms. Dante regards love as the essential word, the key term that escapes precise definition. In his treatise on language, he notes that love remains a residual term from the past, demonstrating that language unites human beings. Love, elusive yet central, is the culmination of the theological virtues. Dante's understanding of love as a linguistic and unifying force is highlighted at the end of Canto 26, when he encounters Adam. This confrontation with the archetypal poet emphasizes the act of naming and bringing the world into being, the true work of the poet as maker. Dante addresses Adam, "O fruit that were alone produced mature." Here, ripeness is tied to grace. Adam is portrayed as having been created in a state of grace, fully mature. The metaphor raises theological questions. Was Adam created already graced? And if so, why did he fall? How could transgression occur if he was in a state of grace? By calling him ripe, Dante implies that Adam existed in a condition of grace at creation, setting the stage for reflection on human potential, fall, and the ultimate role of love as a unifying and transformative force. Dante turns to Adam to resolve these questions, and Adam responds at length. He explains that the tasting of the tree itself was not the cause of exile. Even the fall is framed as a state of exile, from the garden into the wilderness, where Adam must transform the wild land into a garden, with work as the means of regaining what was lost. The real cause, Adam says, was the overstepping of boundaries. Canto 26 of Paradiso mirrors other cantos 26, including the canto in Inferno with Ulysses, who also crosses boundaries. Both Adam and Ulysses transgress limits, yet their forms of knowledge differ. Adam's act of eating the tree is a felix culpa, a fortunate fault, revealing knowledge that elevates him and those who follow. Ulysses, by contrast, wanders without direction or purpose, a gratuitous quest. For Adam, discovery is tied to transgression, but it leads to understanding. The loss of boundaries is a recognition of potential divinity. God imposes limits to make Adam aware of his human nature, yet Adam's pursuit of knowledge shows he can approach the divine. His fall re-establishes these boundaries and constitutes growth in self-knowledge. Knowing oneself, Dante suggests, is itself a form of advancement. The fall is not a simple catastrophe, but a lesson in respecting the limits between human and divine. Dante then turns to language. Adam says that human speech was already changing before the people of Nimrod attempted the Tower of Babel. Reason produces words, but their durability is shaped by human preference, which shifts over time. Nature gives humans language, but its form follows the choices of humanity. Language becomes central, revealing the properties of words and, specifically, theological language. Adam continues, "Before descending into hell, the supreme good was called I on earth, later El." The names, interpreted as Hebrew, indicate that God's name is not fixed. Language changes over time and circumstance. Dante contrasts this with his earlier claim in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, where he held that Hebrew, the language of Adam, remained pure. Here, he acknowledges that even sacred names shift, marking humanity's distance from the divine. Language is part of exile, a reflection of human longing for the divine. With this, the discussion of the virtues in Cantos 24, 25, and 26 concludes. Dante uses theology and examination not to remove us from the world, but to return us to it, where faith, hope, and love operate together. Each virtue is understood through the others. Love requires faith, hope realizes faith, and love realizes hope. Though their full meaning eludes complete comprehension, their interplay guides human life, sustaining belief, longing, and ethical action within the exilic condition of humanity. In Cantos 27, 28, and 29 of Paradiso, Dante presents a theory of creation and cosmology, which are related but not identical. Beatrice explains the shape of the cosmos, a complex task, as Dante navigates two aspects of the universe, a spiritual one and a physical one. Though not exactly the same, the distinction between them is subtle, almost imperceptible. At this point, Dante is within the celestial spheres, having passed the heaven of the fixed stars. In Canto 27, he remains in their afterglow, while Saint Peter, who previously examined Dante, delivers a prophetic denunciation. Peter criticizes the collusion between the papacy, founded because of him, and his successors, the division of the Christian people, the misuse of the keys he was entrusted with, and the use of his image on seals to sell privileges. The speech is fiery and prophetic, but it also recalls the attack on Boniface, shown colluding with Guido de Montefeltro in the parallel canto of Inferno, creating a clear symmetry between the two. After Peter's outburst, Beatrice guides Dante to the next heaven, the crystalline heaven, also called the prime mover. This heaven marks the boundary of the material universe, almost entirely spiritual, but still possessing a thin materiality. It is called the prime mover because it represents the origin of time, space, and motion. Beatrice instructs Dante to look back and measure how far he has travelled from the earth. He observes, from the arc of the sphere, the place beyond Cadiz where Ulysses overstepped the world's boundaries, a deed for which he is damned in Inferno. Dante's attention to Ulysses reflects both fascination and self-questioning. He asks whether he might be lost like Ulysses, while also recognizing that he has surpassed Ulysses' adventure. Where Ulysses only crossed the Pillars of Hercules, Dante now reaches the universe's outermost boundary. At the other end, Dante observes, nearly to the shore where Europa made herself a sweet burden, recalling the myth of Europa's abduction by Jupiter. In this way, intellectual transgression, represented by Ulysses, and erotic transgression, represented by Europa, are intertwined. In Dante's vision, knowledge and desire converge, uniting the beautiful and the good. Dante then moves deeper into the prime mover, the swiftest part of heaven, the source of all motion. He transitions from the ethical scene of Peter's denunciation to the metaphysical realm, which Aristotle and others called first philosophy. It is supreme among the arts and sciences, the culmination of knowledge, dealing with origins, the beginning of the world, causes, and foundations. For Dante, metaphysics and physics are connected, since one explores the theoretical while the other addresses the physical. Together, they form a science of causes and beginnings, revealing the structure and principles underlying the cosmos. In Cantos 27 and 28 of Paradiso, Beatrice begins a discussion of cosmology at the heart of the realm of beginnings. She starts with the sphericity of this space, the nature of the universe, which keeps the center at rest while all else revolves around it, begins here at its starting point, and this heaven has no other where than the divine mind. The true beginning of the universe exists in God's mind. Dante distinguishes between two worlds, the physical world, which humans perceive, and the spiritual world, which resides in God's mind. In this sense, his journey is into the mind of God. Unlike mystical approaches, such as Bonaventure's, Dante seeks to comprehend what lies beyond the physical, rather than entering God's mind mystically. Beatrice offers a more complex account of the cosmos' shape. Light and love encircle it, as they do the other heavens, in a manner that only God, who girds it, fully understands. The prime mover both bounds the physical universe and serves as the threshold to the spiritual one. Physically, it is simultaneously convex and concave, like a semicircle, a spiral shell, or, more accurately, a parchment rolled around a stick and held by a ring, the form of the cosmos as Dante envisions it. Thus, the physical universe consists of successive spirals, alongside which exists a spiritual universe. Beatrice then explains the functioning of time. Its motion is self-determined, while the motion of the other spheres is measured by it. Dante sees time metaphorically as a tree whose roots grow from eternity and whose leaves extend into the temporal world. Time is neither linear nor cyclical like the Platonic wheel of becoming. It emerges from eternity and casts shadows over the world. Beatrice clarifies time and space both for Dante and for the reader, making sense of their interrelation. In Canto 28, Dante moves beyond the physical universe to contemplate the angelic hierarchy. He observes a realm adjacent to the material cosmos, inhabited by angels. Corresponding to the 9 spheres, 7 planets, the fixed stars, and the crystalline heaven, are 9 orders of angels, arranged in 3 triads: angels, archangels, and thrones. The imagery draws on biblical sources and apocalyptic traditions, including Persian influence, while Dante's main sources were Pseudo-Dionysius and Gregory the Great. The two universes share a spherical form, but they are separate hemispheres. Dante notes a difference between his arrangement of the angels and that of Pseudo-Dionysius. All angelic orders gaze upward toward God and impart motion downward, drawing all toward divinity while themselves being drawn. Beatrice explains that the angels' function is to transmit motion to the spheres and serve as messengers between the divine and human realms. In this description, Dante asserts his intellectual independence, showing that his conception of the cosmos and angelic hierarchy is his own, distinct from previous theological authorities. In Canto 29, the focus of cosmology shifts toward the language of creation in a striking and complex way. Beatrice, having spoken at length about the angelic orders, almost without pause turns to the subject of creation. The canto begins with a reference to the children of Latona, the sun and the moon, covered by the ram and the scales, aligning along the horizon in a fleeting balance. For the brief moment when they remain poised, Beatrice is silent, smiling, her gaze fixed on the point that captivates Dante. This opening blends mythological language through Apollo and Diana with scientific terminology, the constellations of the ram and the scales, the horizon as a boundary, and the zenith. Dante emphasizes the delicate balance, the fleeting interval of silence, which marks the transition from the discussion of angels to the discussion of creation. That interval, subtle as it may be, embodies the notion of creation itself. Creation, in Dante's conception, is distinct from an eternal universe without beginning or end, which would lack discernible breaks. Even a minimal pause or difference signals the initiation of the created order. Beatrice soon resumes, now addressing the theory of creation directly. She speaks not to ask but to declare, for she has seen creation at the point where space and time converge. Creation occurs not for God's own gain, which is impossible, but so that his splendor might manifest, saying, "I subsist." In his eternity beyond time and bounds, the eternal love opens into new loves, suggesting a dynamic, generative process. Beatrice clarifies that prior to creation, God did not lie inert. Before and after do not exist outside the created world. This alludes to Aristotle's definition of time as the measure of motion between before and after. In Dante's vision, creation introduces the very distinction of before and after. Form and matter arise together, conjoined and simple, without defect, like three arrows shot simultaneously from a three-stringed bow. Creation is an act of love and passion, a coming together that allows difference to exist where none existed before. She continues, describing the relationship of form and matter as united yet distinct. As a ray passes through glass, amber, or crystal, pervading all without interval, so does the triform effect radiate from its source into being, simultaneously and without distinction of beginning. Through this act, order is established for all substances, with pure act at the summit of the universe and pure potentiality at its base. Dante thus presents creation as the origin of difference, a universe that combines the physical and spiritual, myth and scientific observation, sexuality and cosmology, all giving rise to the distinctions and origins that define the cosmos. Before Beatrice begins imparting her teachings, Dante experiences a fleeting moment in the alignment of the stars, marked by a lingering question. Why this metaphor? It seems to allude to Francesca from the fifth canto of Inferno, as Dante notes that Beatrice was silent, looking fixedly at the point which had overcome me. Francesca had described being overcome by a point, shared with Paolo. In this way, cosmology connects to Ulysses, while creation is tied to Francesca. Dante intentionally references these infernal figures to frame his discussion of the heavens, one transgressing the boundaries of the world in pursuit of knowledge, the other exceeding the limits of love. Knowledge and love appear here in their infernal forms. By doing so, Dante invites the reader to see Inferno in a new light, not merely as a world of rejected souls and horror, but as a source from which to understand the spiritual universe. Hell becomes imaginatively redeemed. The journey back to the beginnings of the cosmos is also a redemption of order. This suggests that the ultimate comprehension of the universe requires the overcoming of evil, so that even hell contributes to knowledge of the cosmic structure. This is the powerful underlying message conveyed through the allusions to Francesca and Ulysses in these cantos within the heaven of metaphysics. Dante's reference to Ulysses in Canto 27 is particularly significant. He is aware of how different he is from Ulysses, but retains a retrospective fascination with the Ithacon traveller. By recalling Ulysses' tragic pursuit, Dante highlights the moment when the Greek hero exceeded all limits, including those of reason, in his philosophical quest. Dante, by contrast, trusts Beatrice to guide him safely, creating a subtle sense of relief. His adventure surpasses that of Ulysses, who ultimately ventured no further than beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Viewed retrospectively, Ulysses can also be seen as a metaphor for the failed metaphysician. In the heaven of metaphysics, which deals with both space and time, the journey from place to place mirrors Ulysses' quest to reach the Absolute, a journey no one had achieved before him except Dante and Paul. Yet metaphysics also involves time, and Dante, attempting to understand eternity and origins, risks localizing time. Beatrice's gaze reminds him of a point of joy that overcomes him. Here, the language subtly evokes Francesca, recalling a kiss or perhaps a desire longed for, though the context remains entirely spiritualized. Francesca herself embodies a kind of metaphysics, a metaphysics of desire. Her desire moves endlessly beyond the objects she attains, burning through them in an infinite progression, first one book, then another, then the entire library. She is metaphysical in her continuous movement of longing. Unlike Ulysses, who is oriented toward place, Ceuta, Seville, and so on, Francesca exists in time, recalling and longing for the past. She represents a complementary, failed metaphysician of desire and temporality. Both figures, in their different ways, would have aspired to what Dante now experiences, witnessing the convergence of space and time, ubi and quando, the point at which all things cohere. Such a stance toward these recurring figures allows Paradiso to be read as an acknowledgement of a kind of schadenfreude. Dante's joy might seem heightened by witnessing those who desired what he now possesses being punished, revealing to him how fortunate he is. Yet this is not exactly Dante's point. He is speaking about cosmology and creation, about the order of everything, and how this order is rooted in love. He comes to understand this order because knowledge and love are intertwined. Knowledge is love, and love is knowledge. What he is really showing is that he can now perceive how things function, while sinful people on earth, those living in the shadows of time, attempted the same understanding but lacked the fortune to reach the heights he has attained. And because he has reached them, they might be able to as well. One could push this interpretation further, even to the extreme, to suggest that the suffering souls in hell might eventually be brought into the blessed company of Abraham. Perhaps that is wishful thinking, yet there is undeniably a theology of redemption embedded in the comedy. It should be emphasized that Dante never explicitly states that the entire cosmos is redeemable. It becomes a consciously articulated theme, but it is never plainly declared. Two ideas support this implication. First, the cosmos as a sphere suggests that any journey toward God is simultaneously a return to the beginning. The spherical form allows everything to return to its origin. Second, there exists the notion of redemption itself. The cosmos can be restored to its original, pristine state. In this sense, the poem carries a theology of redemption that could extend to all creation, a restoration to the beginning. The famous image of the two children of Latona at the start of Canto 29 provides further insight into this theology. In Italian, the first word is when, and the 12th line ends with the same word, when. The first line begins with Latona, the first two letters of which, La, are repeated in the 12th line. This creates a chiasmus, and if one were to draw lines along this structure, they would intersect at the word hemisphere, marking the center of the design. Dante is placing the reader at a cosmic crossroads, indicating not only our location in the universe, but also the hidden, secret laws that govern it. The poem itself is regulated by these same tacit rules. One of these might be the radical possibility of redemption, a complete purification of evil, so that the universe could return to its original, flawless state. The realization of this possibility comes through the incarnation, the redemptive event that makes it possible. A new Adam enters the world, and through his sacrifice and the gift God provides, the incarnation becomes feasible, since human beings alone would be incapable of achieving it. This forms the foundation of the theology of redemption. Humanity cannot save or redeem itself without divine intervention. God, through his Son, acts to restore and reproduce the original order of the cosmos. Yet this does not obscure the interplay between the physical and the spiritual descriptions of the world. There are two hemispheres, distinct yet connected. The spiritual experience of creation allows for the recognition of difference in the universe, challenging the medieval debate over whether the physical world is eternal. One perspective, defended by Aquinas in the Summa contra Gentiles, argued that the Greek philosophical notion of the world's eternity could be demonstrated or refuted through reason, asking questions like, who created the Creator? In contrast, faith allows for the conception of creation tied to freedom. Bonaventure, addressing these debates in 13th century Paris, rejected the eternity of the world. If the world were eternal, there would be an endless succession of generations, which is not observed. Thus, he affirmed creation. Dante intervenes by uniting the physical and spiritual worlds as continuous and complementary, though a subtle difference remains. This difference echoes the intrusion of time in Beatrice's speech, the space between one sound and another. The spiritual universe emerges from the natural world as an act of production and reproduction, rooted in God's love, while the physical world operates in the same manner. There is symmetry in their origins. The two hemispheres remain adjacent, separate yet equal, joined at their edges. This is not Plato's inverted universe, though it resonates with Neoplatonic ideas of emanation. Dante perceives dimensions of reality beyond those imagined by earlier cosmologists. Previously, Dante described his movement through the cosmos, observing the material and spiritual hemispheres with the Empyrean marking the threshold and limit of the physical universe, the gateway to the spiritual cosmos. Now he moves fully into the Empyrean, the culmination of his journey. Here, a transition occurs. The guidance of Beatrice will end in Canto 30 of Paradiso, fittingly mirroring her first appearance in Canto 30 of Purgatorio. Dante must now turn to a historical figure, Bernard of Clairvaux, the French monk renowned for his treatises on contemplation and mystical vision. Bernard prays to the Virgin Mary, who intercedes with her Son, creating a chain of mediation that enables Dante to attain the beatific vision in Canto 33. The poem will reveal the difficulties Dante faces in seeing, recalling, and recollecting this experience. Paradiso concludes by emphasizing the limits of memory and the significance of forgetfulness. In Canto 33, Dante revisits the metaphor from Purgatorio, where he was ritually immersed in the rivers Lethe and Euno, representing forgetfulness and memory. He highlights that both streams originate from the same source, suggesting that memory and forgetfulness emerge from a single material. This prepares the stage for Paradiso 33, where the concept of a forgetful memory comes to the forefront. This is not a mystical assertion, but a justification for the structure and meaning of the entire poem. In Canto 30, Dante enters the heavenly Jerusalem, a space that is simultaneously a garden and a city. It is depicted through a blend of images, beginning with an amphitheatre, a familiar fixture of urban culture. So above the light round and round about in more than 1,000 tiers I saw all that of us have one return up there. And if the lowest rank encloses within itself so great a light, how vast is the spread of this rose in its outermost leaves! The tiers evoke a theatre, an auditorium in which the lowest level still contains immense radiance, hinting at the vastness of the rose that extends outward. The second image used to portray the heavenly Jerusalem is that of a mystical rose, plucked from an otherworldly garden. This rose draws upon a 13th century French poem, The Romance of the Rose, which Dante had translated into a sequence of sonnets as a young man during his poetic experiments. The original poem was satirical, intertwining knowledge, nature, reason, and sexual themes. Dante transforms and spiritualizes this imagery, though the echoes of the original remain. The effect is that the rose conveys both spiritual and material qualities, suggesting the convergence of these realms in the vision of paradise. This layering, the residual materiality within a spiritual context, is a deliberate part of Dante's strategy. The vision continues, into the yellow of the eternal rose, which rises in ranks and expands and breathes forth odors of praise unto the sun, which makes perpetual spring. Beatrice drew me as one who is silent and wishes to speak, and she said, "Behold how great the assembly of the white robes." Here, paradise is experienced as a grand theatrical performance. The theatre metaphor implies the reduction of the world to spectacle, something to be seen and apprehended as a whole. Dante perceives the universe in its entirety, the blessed arrayed in procession, gaining a total perspective rather than isolated fragments. This panoramic vision legitimizes his status as a visionary poet. To see reality fully is to claim the authority of true vision. Beatrice then directs Dante's attention to the city itself. "See our city, how wide is its circuit?" The imagery shifts from rose and garden to city, merging pastoral and urban motifs. The journey of the poem, from wilderness to garden, now culminates in a space that is both garden and city, a reintegration of opposites. The city implies human connection, political life, and engagement with the community, while the pastoral tradition typically separates urban from rustic. Dante collapses this distinction, fusing city and garden, human and natural, in a single eschatological vision. Through this synthesis, Dante brings together oppositions and contradictions, seeking harmony across all dimensions of imagination. In his vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, all divisions cohere, spiritual and material, urban and pastoral, theatre and garden. This unity reflects the poet's overarching aim, to encompass the whole of reality and to bring its apparent contradictions into concordance. In this passage, another image complicates Dante's vision. "See our seats so filled that few souls are now wanted there." The line suggests that for latecomers, there is hardly any room, not even standing room. Almost all places have been taken. On the surface, this might seem apocalyptic, implying that few will be saved and the end of the world is near. Yet Dante's perspective is not that of imminent doom. His concern with renewal, with institutions, with interventions from human or divine sources, indicates a vision framed from eternity rather than the brink of historical conclusion. The few remaining seats are a reflection of the vast passage of time rather than an announcement of the end. A striking image follows, offering insight into Dante's temporal perspective. "And in that great chair whereon you fix your eyes because of the crown that already is set above it, before you sup at these nuptials shall sit the soul, which on earth will be imperial, of the lofty Henry." This refers to the emperor who died in 1313, whom Dante had hoped would come from the Holy Roman Empire to restore order to Italy. Although the emperor's presence is assured in heaven, his beatification does not prevent the continuation of political violence on earth. Political hopes temper Dante's vision here, showing that even in paradise, earthly concerns shape his understanding and preclude a strictly apocalyptic interpretation. If Canto 30 bids farewell to apocalyptic ideas, Canto 31 marks a farewell to Beatrice, Dante's most recent guide. Dante reflects on his journey. He has come from the human to the divine, from temporal to eternal, from Florence to a just and reasonable people, filled with amazement. The joy of this vision leaves him silent and contemplative. As a pilgrim refreshed in the temple of a vow, he surveys the ranks of paradise, observing faces devoted to love, illuminated by divine light, smiling and graced in movement and dignity. He takes in the general form of paradise as a whole, pausing to turn to Beatrice with questions held in suspense. This scene mirrors the earlier moment when Virgil disappears at the approach of Beatrice. Here a variant occurs. Dante expects to see Beatrice, but first encounters an elder, Bernard of Clairvaux, clothed in glory, with eyes and cheeks suffused with benign gladness, his demeanor tender as a father's. Bernard explains that Beatrice has urged him to guide Dante temporarily, and instructs him to look to the circle just below the highest tier, where Beatrice awaits. Dante lifts his eyes and sees her, crowned by the eternal rays. Though distant from the highest region, her image reaches him clearly, unblurred by any separation. Dante acknowledges that all the grace and virtue he has witnessed come from her power and excellence. It is she who has drawn him from bondage into liberty. Here, the central theme of liberty in the comedy is confirmed, embodied in the presence and guidance of Beatrice. In Canto 30, Beatrice had shown concern that Dante had been dwelling too long on appearances, fearing that his attention to outward forms might obscure the truth of things. Dante now returns to the question of images, telling Beatrice that her image is what he will preserve of her. The world, he suggests, is always a world of images, and the image itself becomes a locus of sacredness, even as it remains fleeting. Dante's journey is therefore one that moves between images and essences, preparing for the final leap. His voyage is ultimately not to Beatrice but to God, with Beatrice serving as a stepping stone for entering the beatific vision. Toward the end of Canto 31, Dante compares himself to a pilgrim from Croatia visiting the Vale of Veronica. That pilgrim, whose hunger for the sacred image is never fully sated, asks in thought whether the face on the veil truly resembled Christ. Dante sees himself in the same position, gazing on the living charity of those who, in contemplation, tasted divine peace. The reference to Veronica recalls the pious woman who, according to tradition, wiped Christ's face on Calvary, leaving his image on her veil. Dante evokes the experience of pilgrims coming to see that image, while simultaneously expressing his desire to move beyond mere images and behold what lies behind them. The journey of the Divine Comedy is thus the journey between appearances and essences, structured in tercets. With this understanding, Canto 33, the final canto, opens. Several dramas unfold here. The pilgrim seeks to see the face of God and preserve his understanding in order to retell the vision. He confronts the difficulty of remembering what he sees, and he struggles with the question of what exactly is revealed to him. Dante's task is both to witness and to articulate the vision, balancing the relationship between perception and language. Canto 33 begins with a prayer to the Virgin Mary, built around paradoxes, such as calling her the daughter of her own son or describing her as humble yet exalted above all creatures. These paradoxes challenge conventional reason and indicate that the canto will not offer a rational representation of the divine vision. The motif of birth, recurring from the beginning of the comedy, appears again. In Mary's womb, divine love is rekindled, nurturing the unfolding of the mystical rose in eternal peace. This image of the womb represents the immense sphere of the mystic realm, where finite and infinite converge. The sphere's center is everywhere, its circumference nowhere, an expression of the incarnation and the intersection of human and divine. Two crucial theological elements emerge in this image. First is the humanization of the divine, which enters history and experiences human life. Second is the feminization of the divine, in that God becomes the child of a woman, making the feminine an intrinsic part of the divine reality. Stylistically, the canto employs repetition, as in thee is mercy, in thee pity, in thee munificence, in thee is found whatever of goodness is in any creature. This iterative, anaphoric style serves to create consistency in a language describing vanishing traces, realities that cannot be fully captured in logical propositions. The repetitions generate an incantatory rhythm, forging a more tangible sense of reality through the mood induced by the words themselves. In this final stage, Bernard's prayer continues. He asks the Virgin Mary to grant Dante the grace to rise even higher with his eyes toward ultimate salvation. Bernard distinguishes carefully between he and I, preserving the individuality of Dante within the paradise of imagination, and prays that Dante's mortal limitations be dispelled so that the supreme pleasure may be revealed to him. He continues, asking that Dante's affections remain intact after such an overwhelming vision. The prime danger is that the beatific vision might overwhelm Dante's mind, obliterating his rational powers. Bernard calls on divine protection to subdue human impulses and reminds Dante of Beatrice and the saints, all united in prayer for the pilgrim's safe passage through this vision. The entire cosmos, in effect, joins in asking that Dante survive unscathed. Up to this point, the poem has been described in many ways. A poem of hope, of peace, of exile, of desire, and of love and longing. Bernard's prayer embodies this longing. Prayer is an address to the unseen, a hope for a response, a central mode in Dante's theology. At the heart of his spiritual universe is a constant sense of being displaced, not yet fully at the place he desires, which mirrors one's own religious consciousness. Gradually, however, the tone shifts from desire to enjoyment. Dante begins to taste the fullness of pleasure and sweetness. He approaches the end of all longing, raising the ardor of his desire to its utmost. Bernard gestures for him to look upward, yet Dante has already become what Bernard wished, his sight purified and entering more fully through the loftiest light, which is the ultimate truth. Yet even here comes Dante's first major defeat. The vision exceeds his capacity to describe. His sight is greater than language can convey. This failure, however, becomes a mode in itself. It is not humility for its own sake, but a statement about the poem's form. It represents not only the plenitude of vision, but also the yearning for a vision that may not fully manifest. Memory, too, falters in the face of such excess. The intensity of the experience leaves little for the mind to retain. What remains is the lingering sweetness impressed upon the heart. Dante's journey to God is ultimately a journey of the heart, though it encompasses the mind as well. To know God, one must come to know through the heart. He continues with imagery of dissolution. Thus is the snow unsealed by the sun, depicting the liquefaction and loss of form. Another image follows, recalling the third book of the Aeneid. As the Sibyl's oracle was scattered by the wind across the leaves in her cave, so too does Dante find the vision slipping from his grasp. The words, like the wind-blown leaves, cannot be fully read or held. They mirror the confusion and impermanence of his overwhelming experience. This is the state of mind in which Dante now finds himself, where the vision is beyond both articulation and retention. Dante now turns to a new mode, offering a sequence of prayers. O Light Supreme, who art so far beyond mortal understanding, restore to my mind a portion of what thou didst appear, and grant my tongue such power that it may leave a single spark of thy glory for those yet to come. This prayer expresses the hope that language might triumph over forgetfulness. Dante is emphasizing that his poem is addressed to the future, not to himself or his contemporaries. The work of art is meant to anticipate and prepare a time yet to come, functioning as a forward-looking vision rather than merely as a record of the past. Memory becomes crucial precisely because it allows him to write with authority, to speak of the living and the dead, the powerful and the less powerful, the historical and cultural figures he references. Dante must remember. Memory is the foundation of his representation, even though the poem projects itself forward into the future. Yet remembering is never simple. He struggles to hold on to what he has seen. He reflects, I remember that on this account I was the bolder to sustain it, until I united my gaze with the infinite goodness. The narrative shifts into a meditative prayer. He beseeches the divine to reveal itself and remain with him. He sees, in its depth I saw ingathered, bound by love in one single volume, that which is dispersed in leaves throughout the universe, substances and accidents and their relations, as though fused together so that what I tell is but a simple light. Once again, the cosmos is imagined as a book, echoing the metaphor of Virgil's book from the beginning of the poem. Virgil's volume serves as a prefiguration of the poem itself and of the book of the cosmos now visible to Dante, unified in love. This is a moment of recovered joy, a joy that excludes absence. The universal form of this not I believe that I saw, because, in telling this, I feel my joy increase. Desire gives way to joy, for desire always implies lack, while joy corresponds to plenitude. At this moment, Dante has attained the fullness of experience. The interplay of memory and forgetfulness is expressed through a mythological image. A single moment makes for me greater oblivion than 25 centuries have wrought upon the enterprise that made Neptune wonder at the shadow of the Argo. Time has no hold here, though Dante, as human, remains subject to it. He experiences the eternal instant, whose intensity surpasses all historical forgetting. The allusion to the Argonauts situates Dante's journey within a broader mythological framework. Neptune, dwelling in the depths, represents the divine as both unfathomable and elevated. Dante sees God as simultaneously present at the heights and the depths, and the god's wonder at the daring of man mirrors the daring of Dante himself. Language fails Dante, memory fails him, and now speech itself falters. Now will my speech fall more short, even in respect to that which I remember, than that of an infant who still bathes his tongue at the breast. The term infant is not simply any child. It literally refers to one who cannot yet speak. Dante emphasizes the limitations of his own tongue, not because more than one simple semblance was in the living light wherein I was gazing, which ever is such as it was before, but through my sight, which was growing strong in me as I looked, one sole appearance, even as I changed, was altering itself to me. Within the profound and shining subsistence of the lofty light appeared to me 3 circles of 3 colors and 1 magnitude, and one seemed reflected by the other, as rainbow by rainbow, and the third seemed fire breathed forth equally from the one and the other. Oh, how scant is speech, and how feeble to my conception! Speech cannot contain the plenitude of what he sees. Vision surpasses language, and not everything in Dante's experience can be reduced to syllables. Despite this failure, Dante presses on, highlighting the self-contained nature of the divine. This, to what I saw, is such that it is not enough to call it little. O light eternal, who alone abidest in thyself, alone knowest thyself, and known to thyself and knowing, lovest and smilest on thyself. The repetition of words mirrors the self-enclosed character of God, showing that even as God manifests in creation, an aspect of the divine remains wholly self-transcendent, escaping human grasp. Dante is both awed and engaged, finding a way to relate to this unknowable divinity. That circling which, thus begotten, appeared in thee as reflected light, when my eyes had dwelt on it for a time, seemed to me depicted with our image within itself and in its own color. He does not say, my image. The poem emphasizes the shared human likeness, revealing the human within God, for humans are created in God's image. He continues with an analogy to mathematics. As is the geometer who wholly applies himself to measure the circle, and finds not, in pondering, the principle of which he is in need, such was I at that new sight. I wished to see how the image conformed to the circle, and how it has its place therein, but my own wings were not sufficient for that, save that my mind was smitten by a flash wherein its wish came to it. Here power failed the lofty fantasy. Medieval geometers struggled with paradoxes like squaring the circle, and measurement alone could not solve the problem. Dante then turns to fantasy, the highest form of imagination, where almost anything seems possible, but even fantasy fails to capture the fullness of what he perceives. The poem concludes on a note far more affirmative than the repeated failings might suggest, but already my desire and my will were revolved, like a wheel that is evenly moved, by the love which moves the sun and the other stars. Dante finally comes to comprehend the prime mover, not as he did at the opening of Paradiso, but as love itself. The Aristotelian Thomistic notion of God as merely the prime mover had seemed limited to him, for the prime mover moves the universe yet appears detached from it. Now Dante perceives this primal motion as one of love, a universe held together by God, who transcends yet participates in the world. Love maintains order, moves the sun, the stars, and all things, and is simultaneously the stable principle that allows the cosmos to cohere. Love, however, is not the only crucial word at the poem's end. This canticle, like its predecessors, closes with the word stars. Dante mirrors the symmetry found at the ends of Inferno and Purgatorio. By saying that love moves the sun and the other stars, he immediately situates himself back on earth, back at the beginning of his quest, looking up at the night sky with the reader. The line bridges the vision he has experienced, the vision of the Incarnation, with our own earthly perspective, reminding us that the human likeness is reflected among the stars. It also loops back to Inferno, allowing the story of the poem to begin anew and be retold. The poem recounts the journey of a pilgrim moving from the dark wood to the beatific vision and returning to report it. Yet the circularity of the poem reveals that the journey truly begins only at its conclusion. The act of reading, of engaging with the poem, is the journey itself. The final line draws the reader into Dante's narrative orbit, ensnaring us in the interplay of story and experience. The poem revolves endlessly, mirroring the ceaseless motion of the sun and the other stars, and inviting the reader to dwell in its spell, in the continuous cycle of journeying and recounting.